The morning Marcus Webb disappeared, Evelyn didn't know he was gone. She had opened the shop the same way she did every day. The front door at 6:40, the windows cracked 2 inches to pull in the morning air, the small iron kettle set to heat on the back stove. She arranged the jars along the counter in the same order she always did: valerian root, dried chamomile, black cohosh, the specialty blend she made herself on Sunday nights. The shop smelled like dried earth and something faintly sweet, and she liked that. She had worked a long time to make it smell like something worth walking into. Mercer and Webb Herbal Remedies had been open for 3 years on the corner of Thistle Street and the main road through Caldwell Ridge. It wasn't the kind of business that made anyone rich, but it was steady. Frontier families trusted her. Miners' wives came in for the pain tinctures. The school teacher bought headache powder every 2 weeks without fail. Evelyn knew her customers by name, knew their ailments without them having to explain, and had built the kind of quiet reputation that takes years to earn and can fall apart in a single afternoon. She didn't start worrying until noon when Marcus still hadn't come in. He was late sometimes. He was careless with time in a way that annoyed her, but she had learned to work around it. She filled the orders herself, helped the customers who came in, and told herself he'd walk through the door any minute with some excuse about his horse throwing a shoe or the road being washed out near the creek crossing. By 3 o'clock, she sent a boy with a message to his rooming house on the far side of town. The boy came back with the landlady's reply, written on the back of a piece of brown paper. Mr. Webb settled his account and collected his belongings 2 days ago, left no forwarding address. Evelyn read it twice. Then she went to the back office and opened the iron box where they kept the operating funds. It was empty. Not just low, not just short, empty. The way a thing looks when someone has made a careful, deliberate decision to leave nothing behind. She stood there for a moment with the open box in her hands, and the first feeling she had wasn't anger. It was a strange, cold stillness, like the air before a storm when everything goes quiet and the birds stop. Then she started going through the records. It took her the rest of that afternoon and most of the evening to understand the full shape of what Marcus Webb had done. He had taken not just the operating funds, but every payment he'd collected for the past 6 weeks. He had borrowed against the business's future receivables, loans she hadn't known about, signed with her name on documents she had never seen. He had promised delivery to 3 wholesale buyers and collected partial payment in advance for goods that didn't exist yet. And he had done something worse than all of that. He had used the shop as collateral on a loan he'd taken out from Gideon Blackwood's lending operation, $460. In 1891, on the frontier edge of Montana Territory, that sum was the kind of number that could bury a person. Evelyn sat at her desk in the back of the shop long after it got dark, a single candle burning, the ledger spread open in front of her. She had a pencil in her hand and she kept making small marks beside columns of figures, as if a different approach to arithmetic might change what they added up to. It didn't. She had $11.40 in her personal savings. She had inventory worth perhaps $60 if she sold everything. She had the shop lease, which was in both their names, and she had no legal mechanism to separate herself from the debts Marcus had created in that same shared name. She also had a sister. Clara was 17 and she had been sick since late winter, a lung condition the doctor in town had been cautious about naming but clear about treating. The medication was expensive. The treatment plan he had outlined would take several months and cost money. Evelyn had been carefully setting aside for that exact purpose. That money was gone too. Marcus hadn't distinguished between the business account and the savings Evelyn kept in the same iron box. To him, it had all been numbers to take. She blew out the candle when it burned low, and she sat in the dark for a while. She wasn't a woman who cried easily. That wasn't stubbornness or toughness. It was just that somewhere along the way she had learned that crying took energy, and energy was usually needed for the next problem. So she sat, and she breathed, and she tried to figure out what her actual options were. Selling the inventory would cover perhaps a fraction of the debt. She could try to take on more work. There were other shops in town, a laundry that sometimes hired extra help, families who needed someone to come in and assist with cooking or childcare. But even working every hour of every day wouldn't generate $460 in any time frame that mattered. Blackwood's collector had already been by once 3 days ago when Marcus had first missed a payment. He'd been polite in the way that men who work for powerful people are polite when they don't yet need to be otherwise. He had left a card and said he'd return. Evelyn knew what the return visit would mean. She had heard enough about Gideon Blackwood to know that his patience with delinquent accounts was not a thing to rely on. He was 34, unmarried, and ran the largest private lending and land-holding operation in the territory. He had absorbed 3 failing competitor businesses in the past 2 years, not through kindness, but through the simple mechanical fact that when people couldn't pay, he took the thing they'd used as collateral and added it to his holdings. The shop on Thistle Street would be next. She would lose the lease, the inventory, and whatever remained of the reputation she'd built there, and Clara would lose access to her treatment. Evelyn had never met Gideon Blackwood. She had seen him twice from a distance, once outside the territorial land office, and once riding through town with 2 other men, moving with the particular kind of ease that comes from never having had to hurry for anyone else's schedule. He was tall. That was mostly what she remembered. Tall, dark-coated, not the sort of man who looked around when he moved through a public space, as if he already knew what was there. She didn't sleep much that night. Nest. The collector came back the next morning earlier than she expected, while she was still turning the sign from closed to open. His name was Hatch, a wiry man in his 50s with a neat gray mustache and the watchful eyes of someone who had done this kind of work for a long time and had stopped finding it unpleasant. "Miss Mercer," he said, removing his hat, "I trust you've had a chance to review your situation." "I have," she said. "Come in." She led him to the front counter rather than the back office. The back felt too private, too much like a place where she'd have to sit down and admit things. The front of the shop at least had the counter between them. "I'm going to be straightforward with you, Mr. Hatch," she said. "My business partner absconded with the operating funds and several accounts I didn't know about. I have no way to produce $460 in any short period of time. What I'd like to know is whether Mr. Blackwood would be willing to discuss a repayment structure." Hatch studied her. He didn't seem surprised. She suspected he'd heard variations of this conversation many times. Mr. Blackwood generally doesn't restructure personal debts for third parties. The loan was taken in the business's name. "I'm aware. And I'm the remaining partner, which means I'm the one standing here trying to resolve it honestly." She kept her voice level. "I'm asking whether he's a man who can be reasoned with, or whether this conversation is pointless and I should be preparing to close my doors." Something shifted slightly in Hatch's expression. Not warmth exactly, but a recalibration. "He's a reasonable man," Hatch said carefully. "Whether he'll reason in your direction is another matter. He doesn't typically get involved in individual cases directly." "I'd like to request a meeting." Hatch paused. "That's unusual." "So is my situation." He looked at her for another moment, then nodded once and put his hat back on. "I'll pass along the request. Don't expect much." "Ben..." She expected Blackwood to send a response by note or through Hatch, or perhaps not at all. She did not expect him to walk through her door himself 2 days later, at 4 in the afternoon, with no advance notice and only a brief knock on the doorframe before he came in. She was grinding dried lavender behind the counter, and she looked up to find him standing in the middle of her shop, taking it in with the same unhurried manner she'd observed from a distance. Up close, he was... She couldn't quite land on the word. Imposing wasn't quite right. Not threatening either, though he carried himself in a way that suggested he wasn't unaware of the effect. He wore a dark coat, well cut but not showy, and his face was the kind that didn't give away much, strong jaw, a mouth that sat in a neutral line, dark eyes that moved around her shop with something that wasn't quite curiosity, but was close to it. "Mr. Blackwood," she said. She set down the grinding bowl and came around the counter, because she wasn't going to stand behind it and let him tower over her from a distance. "I didn't know you made house calls." "I don't, generally." He said it without any particular inflection. His gaze had landed on the jars along the back wall. "You organize these by condition, not by plant." She blinked. "Yes, it's more useful that way for customers." He turned his attention back to her. "My grandmother uses something called goldenrod tincture for her joints. She orders it from a shop in Billings. You carry it?" "I make a compound that's similar," Evelyn said. "Better, in my opinion, because the Billings supplier dilutes it more than I do. I can show you the formulation." "Later," he said. "You asked to speak with me." I did. She had prepared for this conversation. She had written notes, organized her points, decided what to ask for, and what she was willing to concede. She folded her hands on the counter and began. The debt attached to this business was created without my knowledge or consent, by a partner who forged documentation and has since disappeared. I have no legal means to pursue him quickly enough to matter. I have inventory worth approximately $60, personal savings of $11, and a sister who requires ongoing medical treatment that I cannot interrupt. She paused. I'm not asking you to forgive the debt. I'm asking for a restructuring that allows me to repay it over time while keeping this business open. Blackwood listened to all of this without moving. His expression didn't change, which she found difficult to read and mildly irritating. You know who I am, he said when she finished. I know your reputation. Then you know I don't do this. I know you haven't, as far as I'm aware. That doesn't mean you can't. She kept her voice even. I'm offering you guaranteed repayment over an extended timeline with the business as continuing collateral. That's better than absorbing a shop you don't need and getting nothing from it. I'd get the lease and the location. That corner is worth more than your inventory. You'd also get a shop that closes in 6 months once the neighborhood figures out I'm gone and starts going to the apothecary on 2nd Street. She tilted her head slightly. I have relationships with these families that took years to build. That goodwill doesn't transfer. It disappears. Something moved through his eyes. Not agreement, but attention. Like she'd said something he hadn't expected. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Why didn't you just find a new business partner? Someone who could buy in and cover the debt? I've been asking that question for 2 days. No one has $400 sitting loose and is willing to tie it to a compromised business in this short a time frame. She met his gaze. Do you have another suggestion? I have a different offer, he said. She waited. He wasn't in a hurry. He looked around the shop again, as if he were thinking something through that he'd already thought through. I have a situation, he said finally. A family situation. My grandmother is ill. Not immediately, but the doctors are not optimistic about the next year. She has been asking, with some persistence, about my plans to marry. She has specific ideas about the kind of woman she wants to see me settled with before she dies. Evelyn stared at him. I don't understand what that has to do with my debt. I need someone to play the role of my wife for a period of 1 year, he said. Not permanently, not actually. A contracted arrangement, legal on paper and presented publicly as genuine, which ends at the conclusion of the term with a quiet, amicable separation. He said it the same way he might have described a business acquisition, factual, organized, stripped of anything resembling discomfort. In exchange, I would eliminate the debt, continue funding your sister's medical treatment for the duration of the arrangement, and provide a monthly stipend adequate to your household's needs. The shop was very quiet. Evelyn realized she had stopped breathing somewhere in the middle of that speech, and she made herself start again. You're asking me to enter a fraudulent marriage. I'm asking you to enter a contract, he said. The marriage would be registered and legal. The fraudulent element is what we tell my grandmother about its nature. That's not a meaningful distinction. It's a precise one. And when it ends, what do I tell people? What do I do with a year of my life I've spent pretending to be someone's wife while my real work sits, in whose hands? Yours, he said. The shop stays open. Hatch handles the accounts. Nothing changes in how you run your business. You would simply need to be present at certain social occasions, be publicly civil, and convince my grandmother that you chose this of your own free will. He paused. She's perceptive, so I'd need someone who could manage that without falling apart. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. She was trying to find the angle, the part he wasn't saying, the piece of this that would make it worse than it already sounded, because it already sounded quite bad. Why me? She asked. You're local, so the sudden relationship is believable. You're known in the community as honest and capable, which reflects well on the story we'd need to sell. You have a clear reason to agree, which means you won't spend the year trying to renegotiate. He paused. And you didn't flinch when I walked in. I'm flinching now, she said. On the inside. Something crossed his face. It was almost, not quite, an expression. I'm sure you are, he said. She turned away from him and walked to the window. The street outside was ordinary. A wagon going by, Two women stopping to talk in front of the dry goods store. A dog lying in a patch of sun near the feed store door. Her street. Her town. The corner where she had spent 3 years of her life building something she was proud of. Clara's face came into her mind. The sound of her coughing in the early morning when the house was cold. The way she had started sleeping with 2 pillows to keep her head elevated. "I have conditions," Evelyn said, still looking at the window. "I expected you would." She turned around. "My sister's treatment is funded regardless of anything that happens between us, including if this arrangement ends early for any reason. That's non-negotiable, and I want it in writing." "Agreed. I keep my shop. My name stays on the lease. No decisions about that business are made without my direct approval. That was already part of the offer. I want it explicit." She crossed her arms. "I will be civil in public. I will attend what social functions are necessary. I will speak well of you when people ask, and I won't deliberately undermine whatever story we construct together. But I will not perform a devotion I don't feel, and I will not pretend this is something other than a contract." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not asking for performance. I'm asking for credibility." "There's a difference?" "Yes." She studied his face. He was hard to read, harder than most people. And she wasn't sure whether that was strategy or simply his nature. She wanted to distrust him. She had good reasons to distrust him. But she was also a practical woman, and practical women, when they run out of better choices, make the choice in front of them. "I want 1 week," she said, "to have an attorney review whatever contract you produce. I'll give you 4 days. The timeline matters." 5. He was quiet for a moment. 5, he said. She walked home that evening in the cool air of a late spring afternoon, and she tried to imagine telling Clara what she had just agreed to consider. Clara was sitting on the porch when Evelyn came up the path, wrapped in a shawl despite the warmth of the day, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. She was 17, and she looked younger, not in an innocent way, but in the particular way that illness strips the edges from a person and leaves them somehow rawer. "You look like something ran over you," Clara said. "Thank you." "Good something or bad something?" Evelyn sat down in the other chair. "Marcus Webb emptied the accounts and disappeared." Clara stared at her. "What?" "All of it. The operating funds, the savings, the payment reserves. And he borrowed against the business. A loan from Gideon Blackwood's operation." "Gideon Blackwood," Clara repeated, as if the name had a taste. "I went to negotiate," Evelyn said. "He has a counter-proposal." She told Clara most of it. She left out a few of the finer details, the duration, the conditions around her medical care, and watched her sister's face move through a series of expressions that ended somewhere between stunned and furious. "He wants you to pretend to be his wife," Clara said, "for 1 year, in exchange for eliminating the debt and continuing your treatment." "My treatment?" Clara's voice got very quiet. "He's using my treatment as a negotiating chip?" "He didn't phrase it as a chip. He offered it as part of the arrangement." "That's... Evelyn, that's... You can't do that." "I might have to." "You're not... You don't have to sell yourself to some... I'm not selling anything." Evelyn kept her voice firm. "It's a contract. Both parties benefit, both parties consent, both parties understand the terms. That's not..." She paused. "That's just business." Clara was quiet for a moment. "You hate him." "I don't know him." "You think he's ruthless and cold and doesn't care about anyone." "I think he's strategic," Evelyn said. "There's a difference." She didn't quite believe that yet, but she was going to need to figure out how to work with someone she didn't trust, and starting from ruthless and cold was not going to make that easier. "What do you actually think?" Clara asked. "Not the practical version. What do you actually feel about this?" Evelyn looked out at the yard where the late light was turning the grass golden. "I feel like I want to find Marcus Webb and have a very direct conversation with him," she said. "And then I feel like I want to find a way to hold this shop and make sure you get better. And those things matter more than how I feel about the man I'd have to work with to make them happen." Clara pulled her shawl tighter. "I don't want to be the reason you do this." "You're not." Evelyn looked at her. "The reason is Marcus Webb. The reason is that I built something and I'm not going to let it disappear because someone else was dishonest. You're just..." She hesitated. "You're the part that makes sure I don't let my pride make the decision instead of my sense." Clara didn't say anything for a while. Then, quietly, "Is he terrible? Blackwood?" Evelyn thought about that. About the way he had noticed how she organized her shelves. About his voice, which was flat and careful but not cruel. About the fact that he had come himself rather than sending Hatch. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. She spent the next 4 days reading the contract he sent over through his attorney. It was thorough. She had expected that. She wouldn't have expected less from someone like Blackwood. It covered the duration, 12 months, beginning at the date of the marriage, the termination conditions, mutual agreement, breach of conduct, death, her financial provisions, the debt eliminated, Claire's treatment funded quarterly in advance, her monthly stipend, the shop's continued operation under her sole management, and a detailed list of the social obligations she would be expected to fulfill. There was language about public conduct, about discretion, about the conditions under which either party could discuss the arrangement privately. She brought it to Ben Aldrich, the only attorney in Caldwell Ridge she trusted even partially, and sat in his office for 2 hours while he read it. "It's clean," he said, which she could tell surprised him. "Unusually clean for Blackwood's work. No hidden provisions that I can find. The Clara treatment clause is ironclad. Even if the marriage ends early, even for cause, those funds are pre-committed and can't be recalled." He set the papers down. "He's either very confident this arrangement will suit him, or very eager to make sure you feel secure enough to agree." "Or both," Evelyn said. "Or both," Aldrich agreed. He looked at her over his glasses. "This is a complicated thing you're considering, Miss Mercer." "Yes." "You understand what a year in Gideon Blackwood's social circle looks like? His grandmother is Lucinda Blackwood. She moves in a different kind of world than this street." "I'm aware. And if anyone finds out the arrangement isn't genuine, I know." She looked at the contract on his desk. "What's your advice?" He was quiet for a moment. "My advice is that you're in a position where the alternative is worse. If that's true, and I believe it is, then this contract gives you as much protection as can be written into 12 months of your life." He paused. "Whether the protection is enough is something only you can judge." She took the contract home. She read it 2 more times. She sat with it the way she sat with difficult decisions. Not forcing a conclusion, but waiting until the noise in her head settled into something she could hear clearly. Then she made 2 small amendments to the language around the shop's operational independence, sent them back through Aldrich, and waited for Blackwood's response. He accepted both amendments without argument. She signed the contract on the 5th day in Aldrich's office, with Hatch and Aldrich as witnesses. Blackwood signed across from her at the same table. They did not shake hands. "When do we start?" she asked. "Saturday," he said. "We'll be seen together in public for the first time. I'll handle the social context." "What does that mean exactly?" "It means I know what story to tell, and I'll tell it." He looked at her. "You don't need to prepare a script. Just act like someone who chose this." "Meaning?" "Meaning, don't look like you're performing," he said. "The single most suspicious thing a person can do in an arrangement like this is try too hard to seem genuine. Just be present. That's all I need." She nodded once. "Fine." The Aldrich house hosts a dinner Saturday evening. Mrs. Fontaine organizes it. She knows everyone in this town, and she'll spread whatever she hears within 48 hours. That's where we start. Evelyn thought about Mrs. Fontaine. She had bought chamomile blend from Evelyn's shop every week for 2 years, and she had opinions about everything and shared them freely. "That's efficient," she said. "I find it useful to understand how information travels," he said. She gathered her copy of the contract and stood up. At the door, she turned back. "One thing," she said. He waited. "I'm not going to do this badly," she said. "Whatever I agree to, I do properly. So if there's something about this arrangement that doesn't work for you at some point, I'd prefer you tell me directly rather than managing around me." She met his eyes. "I can handle direct." Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, she wouldn't call it that, but something. "Noted," he said. She worked the shop the rest of that week with the contract sitting in the back of her mind like a door she'd agreed to walk through and couldn't entirely see beyond. Regular customers came and went. The school teacher bought her headache powder. A miner's wife came in with her youngest, who had a rash on his arms that Evelyn recognized as contact with something in the creek. and she mixed a soothing compound and told the woman to keep him away from the water's edge for 2 weeks. On Friday afternoon, a woman she didn't recognize came in. Older, perhaps 70, with the kind of posture that doesn't come from physical health, but from a lifetime of deciding to hold herself upright regardless. White hair pinned neatly, dark eyes that moved around the shop the same way Blackwood's had, that same attentive, unhurried quality, and landed on Evelyn with a directness that wasn't unfriendly, but wasn't soft either. "The goldenrod tincture," the woman said. "My grandson mentioned you make a compound that might be superior to the one I've been using." Evelyn looked at her and knew, without needing to be told, exactly who she was. "Mrs. Blackwood," she said. "Lucinda," the woman said. "I dislike titles from people who are going to be in my kitchen." "I haven't agreed to be in your kitchen." "You've agreed to marry my grandson." Lucinda Blackwood moved to the counter with the deliberate confidence of someone who has never walked into a room and felt uncertain of her right to be there. "That makes a kitchen reasonable, I would think." Evelyn held her gaze. "He told you." "He tells me more than he thinks he does, and less than he should. But yes." She tilted her head slightly, examining Evelyn with an interest that felt entirely unsentimental. "You're not what I expected. What did you expect?" "Someone softer. Someone who needed him more obviously." The old woman's eyes moved around the shop, the organized jars, the handwritten labels, the small, careful accumulation of a business built by hand. "Someone who could be managed." "I can't be managed," Evelyn said. Lucinda Blackwood smiled. It changed her face considerably. "I know," she said. "That's why I came." She bought the goldenrod compound. She stayed for 20 minutes asking questions about the other preparations with a specificity that told Evelyn she was not a woman who accepted surface-level answers. She asked about Evelyn's training, about where she'd learned her formulations, about the family she'd come from, and what had brought her to Caldwell Ridge. Evelyn answered honestly. She wasn't sure why. There was something in the old woman's manner that made deflection feel pointless. Lucinda Blackwood had the quality of someone who had heard too many versions of the truth to be fooled by a polished one. At the door, Lucinda paused. "He needs someone who won't fold," she said. "That's not a small thing in this family." She looked at Evelyn steadily. "Whether you chose this for the reasons he thinks you did, or for reasons entirely your own, do the job properly and we'll understand each other well enough." She left before Evelyn could respond. Evelyn stood at the counter for a while after that, the shop quiet around her, trying to decide whether she'd just been assessed or warned or both. She thought it was probably both. She thought about Blackwood, who had come to her shop himself when he could have sent Hatch, who had accepted her amendments without negotiation, who had told his grandmother something about a woman he'd met once. She thought about what she'd said to him. "I'm not going to do this badly." She meant it. She had agreed to this, and she would not spend the next year treating it as something to endure. That wasn't who she was. If she was going to be inside this thing, she was going to understand it from the inside. Blackwood's empire, his grandmother's expectations, the territory of the life she was about to move through. And if there were ways to make this serve more than just her own survival, if there were people in this territory being ground under Blackwood's machinery who might benefit from having someone with his ear who wasn't afraid to use it, she was going to find those ways. She had signed a contract, not a silence agreement. She locked the shop at 6 and walked home through the cool evening air, the mountains purple and heavy on the horizon, the lights coming on in the windows of houses where ordinary people were cooking dinner and settling into ordinary evenings. 48 hours from now, she was going to walk into a dinner party on the arm of the most feared man in the territory and smile like it was the most natural thing in the world. She had 5 hours before that to figure out how to mean it. The Aldrich House dinner was the kind of event that Caldwell Ridge held once a month, not because anyone particularly needed another occasion to eat in formal company, but because the town had reached the size where people felt the need to prove they had arrived at something, and a long table with good linen and candles burning down the center was a reliable way to do that. Evelyn had been to 2 of these dinners before. Both times she had sat near the middle of the table and talked with the wife of the grain merchant about practical things. Children, weather, the price of imported goods, and left early enough to avoid having to make conversation with the people at the head of the table, who were always discussing money in the particular way that people discuss money when they have enough of it to find the subject interesting rather than frightening. This time she arrived on Gideon Blackwood's arm. She had chosen her dress deliberately, dark green wool, the best thing she owned, altered twice over the years to keep it fitting properly. It was not the dress of a woman trying to impress, but it was the dress of a woman who took herself seriously, and that distinction felt important. She had her hair up, simply, without decoration, because she'd spent 20 minutes trying to pin something into it and decided the effort made her look like she was trying to be someone else. Blackwood met her at the corner of her street at 7, as arranged. He looked at her for a moment when she came down the porch steps. She couldn't tell if the look meant anything. "You're on time," he said. "I'm always on time," she said. "Are we doing this?" "We're doing this." He offered his arm in the way that men do when they've been trained to do it rather than when they feel the impulse, correctly, formally, without any particular warmth. She took it in the same spirit. They walked the 4 blocks to the Aldrich house in relative silence, which suited her. She was composing herself, organizing her thoughts the way she organized her jars, by what was most immediately useful rather than by category. She thought about what Lucinda had said, "Do the job properly." She thought about what Blackwood had said, "Don't look like you're performing." She decided those 2 pieces of advice were, oddly, the same piece of advice. They were the last to arrive, which she suspected was intentional. The parlor was full when they walked in. 11 people turning at the sound of the door, a collective recalibration of attention that she felt like a physical thing. She had known most of these people for 3 years. She watched them try to reorganize what they thought they knew about her. Mrs. Fontaine was the first to speak. Of course she was. "Evelyn Mercer," she said, her voice carrying the particular pitch of a woman who has just seen something she will be describing to others before the evening is over. "And Mr. Blackwood, together." "Good evening, Mrs. Fontaine," Evelyn said warmly, moving toward her, because moving toward the most dangerous person in the room was always better than letting them come to you. "I hope we haven't kept everyone waiting." The dinner unfolded over 2 hours. Evelyn was not naive enough to think she'd fooled everyone in that room. Some of them were smart, and all of them were curious, and the combination of Gideon Blackwood appearing publicly with a local woman he had no previous connection to was the kind of thing that generates questions with no good answers. But what she could do, and what she did, was behave like someone who was not particularly interested in managing other people's impressions. She talked about her shop, about the spring herbs she was anticipating, about a new formulation she was developing for the miners' coughs. She disagreed with the grain merchant's wife about a local land use question. She ate her dinner. Blackwood was beside her through all of it. He said relatively little at the table. She noticed he rarely did in groups. But when he spoke, people listened, which was the particular kind of social authority that doesn't require maintenance because it's never been in question. Once, when she disagreed fairly sharply with someone about the proposed expansion of a private mining claim into shared grazing land, she felt him go slightly still beside her. She wasn't sure if it was disapproval or something else. Afterward, walking back through the dark street, he said, "You know the Hartley land situation." "I know most of the land situations in this county," she said. "My customers tell me things. People talk more freely to someone mixing their medicine than to anyone else." He was quiet for a moment. "The Hartley claim is mine." She stopped walking. "Excuse me?" "The expanded claim. It's part of a broader land acquisition. I hold the eastern portion. The grazing dispute is—" He paused. "Complicated." "The Hartley family has run cattle on that eastern section for 11 years, she said. "Their lease predates your acquisition by 4 years. Your purchase doesn't dissolve a prior agreement." "The lease expired," he said. "Renewals are at the discretion of the current holder. The Hartley family has 3 children and 40 head of cattle and no other section to move to." She stared at him. "Surely you know that." "I know the details of my own holdings," he said. His voice was still flat, still factual, but something in it was slightly different, a barely perceptible tightening. "What I know and what I do with it are separate questions." "Are they?" He looked at her. The street was dark and she couldn't read his expression clearly, but she had the sense of someone absorbing something rather than deflecting it. "It's late," he said. "That's not an answer." "I know it isn't." He started walking again. "Good night, Miss Mercer." She stood on the sidewalk and watched him go. She was going to have to figure out how to handle a man who could end a conversation simply by deciding it was over. But she was also going to remember that he hadn't denied it. He hadn't made an excuse. He'd said what I know and what I do with it are separate questions, which was the statement of someone who was aware he was doing something he could choose not to do. That was a different thing than someone who didn't know or didn't care. It wasn't better, exactly, but it was different. The weeks that followed had a strange doubled quality. Her life proceeding in its ordinary shape during the days, the shop and the customers and Clara's appointments with the doctor, and then these new obligations layering over it like a transparency placed on top of a map. Twice weekly, sometimes 3 times, she was expected somewhere in connection with Blackwood. A lunch with a business associate's wife, a walk through town on a Sunday afternoon, visible and unhurried. A visit to the territorial land office, where he was reviewing some document, and she was present in the background reading. She didn't mind the reading. She minded the waiting, the sense of filling a space rather than occupying it. She started bringing her own work, notes on formulations, the small notebook where she tracked which customers had been in and what they'd needed, and found that having something useful in her hands made the performance feel less like one. Gideon noticed. He didn't say anything for the first 2 visits. On the third, sitting across from her in his office while she worked through a note on a dried root compound she was considering, he said, "What is that?" "A formulation. I'm trying to balance something for a patient who can't tolerate one of the components I normally use." He looked at the notebook. "May I?" She handed it over. He studied the page for longer than she expected. "Why the substitution here?" he asked, pointing at a line. "Because she's nursing a child, and that compound passes through milk. The alternative is milder, but the ratio is different, so I'm working out whether the dosage achieves the same effect or whether I need to adjust the frequency." He looked at the page a moment longer, then handed it back. "You trained formally?" "I had a teacher for 3 years. Then I read everything I could find and worked the rest out by doing." "Where did you find the books?" "Borrowed them, copied the parts I needed, ordered 2 from a publisher in St. Louis, and paid for them over 4 months. She looked at him. Not everyone has the option to just acquire what they need. He absorbed that without visible reaction. "No," he said, "I suppose not." It wasn't an apology. She didn't know if she'd wanted one, but she noticed he remembered that conversation because 2 weeks later a package arrived at the shop from a bookseller in St. Louis, a medical reference on botanical compounds she'd seen listed in a catalog once and not been able to afford. There was no note. She knew who had sent it. She didn't thank him directly, but the next time she was in his office, she told him the formulation problem had been resolved and that the patient was doing better, which was the closest she could come to acknowledging the gesture without making it into something neither of them were ready for it to be. It was Lucinda who began to complicate things. The old woman had made it clear from that first visit to the shop that she intended to form her own opinion of Evelyn independent of whatever version Gideon was presenting, and she pursued that intention with the energy of someone who has decided that time is limited and conversation is therefore not a thing to approach casually. She invited Evelyn to tea on a Wednesday afternoon at the Blackwood family house on the hill above the main road. Evelyn had seen the house from town. Stone construction, older than most buildings in the territory, with a wide porch and a view of the mountain range that suggested someone, at some point, had built it to last rather than to sell. Lucinda met her at the door herself, which Evelyn suspected was another form of assessment, seeing how a person reacts when they're not shown to a room by a servant, but simply walked in by the person they came to see. The front hallway was full of things. Not clutter exactly. Everything was organized, but there were objects everywhere, accumulated rather than curated. Framed maps, stacked books, a coat rack with 3 generations of different-sized coats, a side table with a collection of rocks that looked geological rather than decorative. "Gideon's father collected those," Lucinda said, seeing Evelyn look at the rocks. "He was interested in what the land was made of. Gideon inherited the interest without the sentimentality. He wants to understand the land for what it can produce. His father wanted to understand it because he found it beautiful." She led Evelyn to a sitting room that had the same quality as the hallway, a life lived in a space rather than managed in it. The chairs were worn, the tea service was excellent but old. "You're wondering why I'm telling you that," Lucinda said. "I'm wondering if it matters," Evelyn said, "what his father was like. It always matters what a person's parents were like, the old woman said. It's not determinative, but it explains the shape of the problem. She poured tea with steady hands that belied whatever the doctor had said about her joints. Gideon was 12 when his father died. He had a business that was doing well and an estate that was manageable. Gideon took everything over at 22 when his mother followed, and he turned manageable into something considerably larger. Brukush Sauji was, she paused. In the process, he made certain decisions about what kind of man he was going to be. Efficient, Evelyn said carefully. Cold, Lucinda said without apparent distress. He chose cold because it worked. A man who doesn't feel the cost of things doesn't hesitate, and hesitation, on the frontier, in business, with money, hesitation loses. He learned that, and he applied it. She looked at Evelyn directly. He's good at it. He's also very lonely. Evelyn looked at her tea. I don't think he'd want me to know that. I don't imagine he would, Lucinda said. That's why I'm telling you instead of him. There was a pause between them that wasn't uncomfortable. It had the quality of two people deciding how much of the truth to walk toward. He's never brought a woman to a dinner, Lucinda said finally. In 12 years of building that company, there have been associations. Nothing he introduced, nothing he named, nothing that lasted. Whatever you are to him, you're something different from what he's allowed before. I might be a practicality, Evelyn said quietly. You might be, Lucinda agreed. But I've watched him these past weeks, and there is something different in his manner, and I don't say that as a grandmother who wants to believe things. I say it as a woman who has known him since he was this high, and who has seen what his face looks like when something is just a practicality. She set down her cup. It doesn't look like that. Evelyn didn't know what to do with that. She filed it somewhere she could think about later, in the space where things went when she wasn't ready to know what to make of them. She stayed 2 hours. They talked about the Goldenrod compound, about a local family Lucinda had been helping quietly for years, about the mountain country and what the winters were like when the Blackwood family had first settled here. Lucinda was funny in an unexpected dry way that ambushed you, a flat remark that landed before you realized it was meant to be one. Evelyn found herself laughing twice, genuinely, and felt oddly disloyal about it, as if enjoying the grandmother made the arrangement more complicated rather than less. Walking back down the hill toward town, she thought, of course she's interesting. Nothing about this was going to be simple. The social obligations in themselves she could manage. It was the negotiations she hadn't anticipated. It started with the Hartley land situation. She had put it aside after that first night, filed it as something she had said her piece about and would leave alone. But then Margaret Hartley came into the shop on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks into the arrangement, with her youngest son on her hip and the particular look of someone trying very hard to conduct a normal errand when nothing in their life currently feels normal. Evelyn knew Margaret well. She'd provided the family with various compounds over the years. The boy's ear infections, Margaret's headaches, her husband Clem's back trouble from years of working his own land. She had a broad face, a practical manner, and she almost never brought her problems to anyone else's attention. She bought what she came for, chatted briefly about the weather, and was nearly at the door when Evelyn said, "How's the grazing situation going?" Margaret stopped. A long pause. "We're waiting," she said without turning around. "The renewal notice still hasn't come." "I see," Evelyn said. Margaret left. That evening, when Evelyn was scheduled to have dinner with Blackwood at his house, one of the regular private appearances they maintained to sustain the impression of a genuine domestic life, she arrived at the appointed time, sat down, waited for the housekeeper to bring the first course, and said, "I'd like to talk about the Hartley lease." He looked at her across the table. "We discussed this. You said what you know and what you do are separate questions. I'm asking you to consider narrowing that gap. This isn't your business. Margaret Hartley was in my shop today," she said. "She has a nursing child and a 4-year-old with chronic ear infections and a husband with a bad back from working land they've worked for 11 years, and she came in and bought headache powder and didn't say one word about the fact that your office has been sitting on their renewal notice for 2 months. She met his eyes. She's too proud to ask anyone for anything. So I'm asking." Blackwood set down his fork. He looked at her. One of those long, unreadable looks that she was beginning to understand didn't mean nothing. They meant he was actually processing something rather than formulating a response. The eastern section is part of a land assembly, he said. The whole package has more value unified. Breaking it out to honor a grazing lease diminishes that value by approximately 15%. And the Hartley family's livelihood is not my responsibility to sustain. I'm not asking you to sustain it. I'm asking you to not destroy it through paperwork delay. She kept her voice even. There's a difference between not helping someone and actively taking away what they already have. Something moved through his face. Not capitulation. She was learning that Blackwood didn't capitulate. He reconsidered, which looked different. The land assembly timeline is 18 months, she said. I looked at the public records. The unified purchase isn't planned for completion until late next year at the earliest. That's 18 months during which the Hartley family could continue to use a section that you're not doing anything with. He was quiet for a moment. You read the public land records. I told you. People tell me things. I pay attention. She picked up her own fork. Will you renew the lease? Another pause. I'll review the terms of the assembly, he said, which was not a yes and was not a no. And she had learned enough about him by now to understand that this was as close to a commitment as he got before he'd actually decided something. The renewal notice went out to the Hartley family 10 days later. She heard about it from Margaret, who came in to buy joint salve and mentioned it in passing, quietly, with the careful dignity of someone who has received good news they don't entirely understand and aren't sure who to thank. Evelyn didn't mention it to Blackwood, but she thought about it. The fact that he had done it without announcement, without pointing back to their conversation, without using it as a credit to claim against her. The Hartley situation was the first. It was not the last. Word moved through the territory the way it always does in a small world, sideways, through third parties, along routes that aren't visible until something is already traveling them. Within a month of the Aldrich dinner, people who had dealings with Blackwood's operation had noticed that he had a companion now, and that the companion was Evelyn Mercer, who ran the herbal shop on Thistle Street, and that she was, by all accounts, not the kind of woman to be managed. This generated a secondary effect that Evelyn hadn't fully anticipated. People started coming to her. Not dramatically, not with explicit requests. But a supplier came into the shop and mentioned, while buying a fever powder, that his contract with Blackwood Enterprises was up for renewal, and the new terms were considerably less favorable than the previous ones. A school teacher, not the same one who bought headache powder, a younger one, newly arrived from the east, mentioned that the school's building fund application had been sitting unreviewed for 4 months. A rancher's wife brought in her daughter for a cough consultation, and before she left said, almost as an aside, that the water access situation on the South Road had been a problem since the creek diversion, and did Evelyn happen to know if anyone had been looking at that? She started keeping a separate notebook. She didn't tell Blackwood about it for 3 weeks. Then, at dinner one evening, when he was describing a new infrastructure project he was planning in the northern part of the territory, she put the notebook on the table beside the plates. He looked at it. What is that? An informal record of situations in this territory that intersect with your business operations, she said. I've been collecting them. He picked it up. She watched his face as he read. The stillness that crossed it, the slight tension around his jaw. You've been running a parallel audit, he said. I've been listening to people who talk to me, she said. Which is different, but the effect is similar. He went through the notebook slowly. She ate her dinner. He set it down beside his plate and didn't pick up his fork. The water access situation I can address, he said. That's a genuine oversight. It wasn't intentional. The creek diversion affected a drainage calculation and no one flagged it. The school building fund, he paused. That's been delayed because the committee's application had a legal deficiency in the land use designation. It wasn't reviewed because it would have been rejected. Did anyone tell the committee that? A beat. No. So they've been waiting 4 months for a rejection that was never sent. She looked at him. That's worse than the rejection would have been. I know, he said, and there was something in those 2 words, not defensiveness, not dismissal, that made her look at him more carefully. Something that sounded, under the flatness, like something he actually meant. Who handles the correspondence for those applications, she asked. Reeves, my administrative director. Does he understand that unresponsiveness causes a different kind of harm than negative response? He manages a large volume of Gideon. She used his first name without meaning to. It slipped out with the directness she'd been working up to, and she didn't take it back. I'm not asking you to agree with every decision I think you should make differently. I'm asking you to think about the fact that the people who live and work in this territory are not line items. They have plans that depend on responses. Silence isn't neutral. He looked at her for a long moment. The candlelight between them was low. Outside, the wind had picked up and she could hear it moving around the corners of the house. "You're going to keep doing this," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. Bringing me notebooks full of other people's problems. I'm going to keep paying attention," she said. "What you do with it is your decision. It always will be." He was quiet. Then he picked up his fork. "I'll speak with Reeves," he said. She hadn't expected to start understanding him. She had expected to observe him, to work with him, to maintain the arrangement competently until it expired. She had not expected the process of being close enough to watch him work to teach her things about him that his reputation did not contain. He was meticulous in a way that was almost excessive. Contracts read in full, documents cross-referenced, decisions that most businessmen made on instinct preceded by a visible, careful process of consideration. He was quiet in a way that was not the same as reserved. She had initially read it as indifference, but she came to understand it was something closer to the opposite. He noticed more than he commented on. He retained more than he revealed. He was bad at ordinary conversation in the way that people are bad at things they were never taught. Not socially inept. He could perform the mechanics when required, but genuinely at a loss in the space between formality and intimacy, the middle register where most human interaction actually happens. He defaulted to information and problem solving because those were familiar terrains, and watching him navigate the unfamiliar ones was the closest thing to vulnerable she had seen in him. She caught him once, late on a Tuesday evening when she'd stayed past the time she normally left, reading a letter at his desk with an expression that was unguarded in a way she'd never seen in public. Just tired. Not the neutral flatness he maintained everywhere else, but actual tiredness, the kind that has weight behind it. She said nothing. She gathered her things and left, but she thought about it afterward. She thought about what Lucinda had said. He chose cold because it worked. And she thought about what it costs a person to make that choice at 22 and then spend 12 years maintaining it, not because they want to, but because stopping requires admitting that you started. She didn't know if she was sympathetic. She wasn't sure sympathy was the right word, but she was beginning to understand that the man behind the reputation was not what the reputation described, which was a more complicated thing to deal with than a simple confirmation would have been. 3 weeks before the scheduled wedding, things shifted in ways she hadn't planned for. They were at the Blackwood house on a Sunday, one of the standing social visits. Lucinda present, the three of them in the sitting room after a lunch that had been surprisingly unstrained given that it contained 2 people in a fraudulent arrangement and one woman sharp enough to see most of the things people tried to hide from her. Lucinda had been talking about a property the family had owned in the mountains, a retreat house, she called it, built by Gideon's grandfather and used sporadically until it had been abandoned some 15 years ago. "I used to think about having the ceremony there," Lucinda said, with the particular casual precision of a woman dropping something she's been saving. When Gideon eventually married, the mountains, the old property, it was a beautiful setting. "It hasn't been touched in 15 years, Gideon said. "Which is a circumstance, not a decree," his grandmother said mildly. There was something in the old woman's face as she said it, a wistfulness that she permitted briefly and then covered, and Evelyn recognized it as the expression of someone who knows she has a limited number of windows left and is looking through this one carefully. Evelyn glanced at Gideon. He was looking at his grandmother with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something that might have been, in another man, the precursor to softness. He said, "The ceremony is already arranged." "At the church on 2nd Street, Lucinda said, "which is perfectly adequate. I only mention it." She picked up her tea. She did not mention it again that day. She didn't need to. Evelyn had seen what it had left in the room when she put it down. On the walk back to town, after they'd said goodbye at the door, Gideon was quiet for longer than usual. Evelyn let it sit. She had learned that pressing him produced less than waiting. "The retreat property," he said finally. "I haven't seen it in 10 years. "Lucinda has," Evelyn said. "She looks at it in her mind, anyway." Another silence. She's not going to be here much longer, he said. The flatness in his voice was different from the usual flatness, stripped rather than chosen. I know, Evelyn said quietly. She's been managing this. He stopped, started again. She doesn't show it. She doesn't let you see it. I know, Evelyn said again. She's like you that way. He looked at her. She couldn't quite read the look, but it stayed on her face longer than his looks usually did. I'll look into what condition the retreat property is in, he said. You don't have to. I'm aware, he said. I'll look into it. She walked the rest of the way home alone, the early evening cool and the mountains dark against a sky that had just started to go purple. She thought about Lucinda's face. She thought about Gideon's voice when he said she won't be here much longer. She thought about the particular shape of a person who has made themselves hard in order to survive, and then found themselves standing in front of something they can't protect themselves from with hardness. She thought, I was not supposed to understand him this much by now. She thought, this is going to be more difficult than I calculated. She had 11 months left on the contract. She had a shop that was running, a sister who was getting better, a debt that had been erased from her name. She had what she had agreed to get. She went home, made tea, sat with Clara on the porch until the night came fully in, and deliberately did not think about any of it for the rest of the evening. She was not entirely successful. The storm came on a Thursday, 3 weeks before the wedding date, and it came the way the worst storms always do on the mountain frontier, without the courtesy of a long warning. There had been signs, if you knew what to look for. The particular quality of silence that settles over the high country when the pressure drops. The way the horses at the livery had been restless for 2 days running. A heaviness in the air that Evelyn felt in her joints before she identified it consciously as weather. But nobody had expected what actually arrived. Not the scale of it, not the speed, and certainly not the specific and terrible precision with which the worst of it landed. She heard about the church on Friday morning. Ben Aldrich came into the shop before she'd finished opening up, still in his coat, and stood at the counter with the expression of a man delivering news he'd rather not carry. The Second Street Church took the full weight of it, he said. The bell tower came through the roof. They're saying it's a total loss, structurally anyway. Months before it's usable again, if they can rebuild it all. Evelyn stood with a jar of dried valerian in one hand and said nothing for a moment. The wedding venue, Aldrich said, though she'd already arrived there. Yes, she said. I understood. He gave her a long look. Are you all right? I'm fine, she said, which was mostly true. The church itself meant nothing to her beyond logistics. She had no attachment to the location. What she was calculating, even as she stood there, was the effect on Lucinda. A postponement. More time in which the old woman would wait for something she'd been told was coming. More weeks of a fiction that was already costing everyone in the arrangement something they hadn't initially priced in. She set down the valerian jar and picked up her coat. I have somewhere to be, she told Aldrich. Gideon was already at his grandmother's house when Evelyn arrived. She hadn't sent word ahead. She'd simply walked up the hill at a pace that left her slightly breathless at the door, which the housekeeper opened before she knocked. Apparently she'd been expected, or at least not unexpected. She found them in the sitting room. Lucinda was in her usual chair, upright, composed, with the careful stillness of someone holding themselves together through the deliberate application of posture. Gideon was standing near the window. Not pacing, he didn't pace, but positioned in the way that people stand when sitting would require admitting that they don't know what to do. He looked at Evelyn when she came in. She looked back. You heard, he said. Ben Aldrich came by. She came into the room and sat, not in her usual chair but in the one closer to Lucinda. How are you feeling? She asked the old woman. Like someone who has waited long enough that one more delay is not catastrophically different from all the previous ones, Lucinda said. The dryness in her voice was present, but thinner than usual. However, I'll admit I'm tired of waiting. Then we won't delay, Evelyn said. Both of them looked at her. The retreat property, she said. She looked at Gideon. You said you'd look into the condition of it. What did you find? A pause. It's been empty 15 years. The main structure is sound, stone foundation, the walls are intact, but the interior needs significant work. Windows, floors, the chimney hasn't been maintained. It's not. How long would it take with adequate labor and materials? He studied her. 3 weeks. Possibly less if the weather... That's exactly how long we have. She looked at Lucinda. You said you used to imagine a ceremony there, in the mountains, on the family's land. Was that a casual thought or something you actually wanted? Lucinda was quiet for a moment. It was something I actually wanted, she said, for a long time. Evelyn turned back to Gideon. Then that's where we're doing it. The silence that followed had a specific texture. Gideon was looking at her with an expression she recognized from the first time she'd proposed something that rearranged his assumptions. That moment of recalibration, where the logical objections formed and then stalled against something else. The logistics alone, he started, are considerable, yes. Guests will need to travel to the mountain property instead of walking to the town church. Food, accommodations for those coming from a distance, the grounds themselves. She met his eyes steadily. None of that is impossible. It's just work. Evelyn, she wants to see this happen in a place that matters to her family, Evelyn said, and she kept her voice even, but there was something in it, something that had moved past practicality into something more direct. She's been patient with all of it, with us, with the timing, with whatever version of this story we've been asking her to believe. She paused. We can give her this. So let's give her this. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at his grandmother. Lucinda's face was very still, and Evelyn could see she was working hard to keep it that way. All right, he said. Chep. The next morning, before 6, they drove north in Gideon's wagon along a road that deteriorated steadily from graded dirt to something that was more suggestion than surface. The mountain came up around them as the valley fell away, the air thinning and cooling, the pine trees thickening on either side until the road moved through them like a tunnel with sky at the top. Evelyn had dressed practically. Her work clothes, good boots, her hair in a simple braid. She had a notebook open on her knee and a pencil behind her ear, and she was watching the terrain with the attention of someone taking inventory. Gideon drove without talking, which she'd come to understand wasn't unfriendliness, but concentration. He drove well, competent with the horses on the difficult road, reading the terrain ahead rather than reacting to it. The retreat property appeared around a curve in the road with no warning. Suddenly there, in a clearing that opened up among the trees, facing east toward the valley below and south toward the mountain ridge. It was a long, low stone building with a wide covered porch along the front, and 2 outbuildings behind it, and a meadow to the left that had gone wild with years of no tending, but was beautiful for exactly that reason. Tall grass moving in the morning air, wildflowers scattered through it, the mountains framing the whole of it against a sky that was, this morning, very clear and very blue. Evelyn stepped down from the wagon and stood looking at it. It's extraordinary, she said, and she meant it without any intention to mean it. The word came out before she'd decided whether it was wise to say. 15 years ago it was, Gideon said. He'd come to stand beside her, looking at the building with a different quality of attention. Someone reading a place that had been part of his life at an age when things settle into you without your permission. My grandfather built the main house. My father extended the porch. He said it needed to face the view properly. He paused. He was right about that. They went inside. He was right that the work was considerable. The main hall had taken water through a failed section of roofing, and the floorboards in that area had warped and cracked. The chimney in the main room needed relining. 3 windows along the east side had deteriorated beyond repair and would need full replacement. The outbuildings were in better shape than the house. The stone had held, and what damage existed was primarily to wooden elements that could be replaced. But the bones of it were there, strong and solid, the way things are when they were built by someone who expected them to outlast him. The main hall, once the damaged section was repaired, was large enough for the ceremony and a gathering of perhaps 60 people. The porch would extend that space on a good day. Evelyn walked through every room with her notebook, making marks and measurements and notes on the order of work needed. Gideon followed, contributing information where he had it, what the original construction had used, where the building materials had come from, which of the local laborers knew the property. At some point, she became aware that she had stopped performing inventory and started talking to him the way she talked to herself when she was working out a problem. Free associative, bouncing between different aspects of the task, occasionally contradicting an earlier note and revising it aloud. and he had stopped answering in information blocks and started responding to what she'd actually said, rather than the formal surface of it, pointing out a structural detail she'd missed, questioning a sequence she'd proposed, suggesting an alternative to a solution she'd been stuck on. They had been working for 2 hours before she registered it consciously. This was the first conversation they'd had that had no social architecture around it. No dinner table, no third parties, no management of impressions. Just a building that needed work and two people trying to figure out how to do it. She stopped in the middle of measuring a window frame and looked at him. He was crouched near the damaged flooring, running his hand along the edge of a warped board, figuring out where the replacement would need to start. "You know construction," she said. "I know a lot of things," he said, not looking up. "That's not—" She paused. "Most men who own things don't know how they're built." He did look up then. "I spent 2 summers working construction before I had the money to stop. I wasn't always this." He said this without particular inflection, but she heard something under it. Not embarrassment, but a kind of flatness that covered something. "This isn't bad," she said. "I know what it is," he said. She looked at him for a moment. He had gone back to the floorboard, that carefully neutral attention he used when he was finished with something. She made her note and moved to the next window. They came back down the mountain in the late afternoon, and Gideon had workers and materials organized before the end of the following day. He did it the way he did most things, efficiently, without ceremony, with an attention to the right people for each task rather than simply the fastest available option. He hired a crew of 8, sourced the timber locally from a mill that owed him nothing so there could be no question of the quality, and arranged delivery of the window glass from the nearest supplier who could guarantee the measurements. Evelyn came up to the property every other day to track progress and make additional decisions that the work kept generating. A question about the porch railing replacement, the color of the window frames, whether the damaged portion of the floor should be replaced with matching timber, or whether a different wood would be structurally stronger even if less identical. She answered all of these with the same practicality she applied to everything, and she was aware that she was putting significantly more care into this than the arrangement strictly required. She was aware, too, of what was happening in the work, the way that a building reveals itself when you attend to it. Old marks on the walls from furniture long removed, a child's height scratched into the doorframe in the back hallway, starting at perhaps 3 feet and going up in uneven intervals to what looked like about 5.5 before stopping. She stood and looked at those marks for a while, calculating the years they represented. "That was me," Gideon said. He was behind her. She hadn't heard him come in. She turned. He was looking at the marks with a stillness that she was beginning to understand was his version of something else. "Your father did it?" she asked. "My mother," he said. "She kept track of both of us. My sister's marks are on the other side of the frame." He was quiet for a moment. "She died at 9. My sister, before my father." Evelyn said nothing. There was nothing to say that would improve on the silence, and she knew the difference between a silence you should fill and one you should leave alone. "I hadn't thought about this doorframe in probably 20 years, he said. "It held," she said quietly. "The frame. Everything else needed work, but this held." He looked at it a moment longer, then he turned away, back toward the work at hand. "The window measurements came in short on the east side," he said. "We'll need to—" "I know," she said. "I already sent a correction." He nodded and moved on. She stood in the doorway for another moment, looking at the marks on the frame. Then she followed him. 2 weeks into the rebuilding, the trouble arrived from the direction she had been watching without knowing she was watching. His name was Foster Crane. He was 48, well-dressed in the way of a man who spends money to look like he isn't spending it, and he had been in Caldwell Ridge for 3 weeks on business she hadn't been able to fully determine. He appeared at 2 of the social gatherings she and Gideon attended together, and she noticed him both times, not because he was obvious, but because he watched Gideon with the particular attention of someone who had an agenda he hadn't announced. She asked about him casually, the way she asked about most things, through the network of information that ran through her shop, quietly, without appearing to be asking. What she learned was this. Foster Crane had been a business rival of Gideon's nearly 10 years ago, in a land dispute that had ended badly for Crane. He had lost a significant portion of his territorial holdings as a result of the judgment and had spent the subsequent years rebuilding in other counties. His reappearance in Caldwell Ridge was recent and, by all accounts, unannounced. She told Gideon about it on the third day she knew. He listened without interrupting, which was how he always listened. When she finished, he said, "I know about Crane." "You know he's here?" "I've known for 2 weeks." She looked at him. "Were you going to tell me?" "I was managing it." "Managing it," she repeated. "You were managing a situation involving a man who has a specific grievance against you, who is attending the same social events as us without mentioning it to me. I didn't want to—" He stopped. "What?" "Complicate your part of this," he said, and for a man who chose his words carefully, that one came out slightly less carefully than usual. She studied his face. "I'm your wife," she said, and the word, used with that direct, practical weight, settled between them differently than it had the time she'd said it for performance. "Publicly, for the purposes of this arrangement, that means you don't manage things around me. You tell me." He was quiet for a moment. "Crane is looking for leverage," he said. "He has a theory about certain land transfers that took place 9 years ago. His theory is not accurate, but theories don't require accuracy if the person stating them does so publicly and loudly in a territory where the business climate is already uncertain." "He's planning to say something publicly." "Yes." "When?" "I don't know. Possibly soon. Possibly at the wedding." She absorbed that. "You think he'd do it at the wedding?" Crane understands that the most effective time to discredit someone is when their attention is divided and their audience is captive. He said it without visible anger. Just that characteristic flatness that she now understood was not the absence of feeling, but its compression. He's been patient for 9 years. A public occasion with half the territory in attendance is exactly his preferred stage. She thought about Lucinda, who was traveling up to the mountain property for this. Lucinda, who was going to stand in the meadow her husband had cleared and watch her grandson marry and have perhaps one good afternoon at the place she'd been thinking about for 15 years. "What's the actual status of the land transfers?" she asked. "Not what Crane says, what actually happened. The transfers were legal. I have documentation. But legal and publicly defensible are sometimes different things when the person attacking you controls the narrative in the room." "Then we control the narrative first," she said. "It's not that simple." "I didn't say simple. I said first." She met his eyes. "What did you actually do, Gideon? The whole of it, not the defensible version. What happened with those land transfers?" He held her gaze. This was the thing about Evelyn Mercer. She asked the questions that other people tactfully avoided. And she asked them looking directly at you, and there was something about that directness that made deflection feel worse than honesty. "The transfers were legal," he said again. "But I knew at the time that Crane's claim had a procedural weakness I was exploiting. He would have won in a fairer fight." A pause. "I was 24. I needed the eastern section for an access road, and he was standing between me and it, and I found the angle that worked." The room was quiet. "Thank you," she said. He blinked. Just slightly. "For what?" "For telling me the true version." She looked at the table between them. "I can work with the true version. I can't work with the one that makes you look correct." He was still watching her. "What are you proposing?" "I'm proposing that we get there first," she said. "Not a confession. You don't owe Crane a confession, and the transfer was legal regardless of your intentions. But if there's a way to address the historical situation proactively, before he makes it a public accusation, then the story changes. You control it instead of him." "How? Is there anything in the current situation that would allow for a genuine resolution? Not because he's right, but because it's better than the alternative." She looked at him. "Does Crane want something he could reasonably have, or does he want to destroy you?" A long pause. "He wants the access rights to the Norris Creek tributary. He always did. The land itself he could work around. It was the water access that mattered for his eastern operations. And now, does he still need the Norris Creek access? He's been working without it for 9 years. That doesn't mean he wouldn't take it if offered." She leaned forward slightly. "You're not in the same position you were at 24. You don't need to fight the way you did then. If offering Crane a legitimate access arrangement now diffuses what he's planning and settles a thing that was, by your own account, not fully fair. Is that something you could do?" He looked at her for a long time. "You're asking me to negotiate with someone who came here to threaten me. I'm asking you to consider whether the thing he actually wanted, 9 years ago, is something you could give him now, without it costing you what it would have cost you then. She held his gaze. You're different now than you were at 24. You have more room to move. That's not weakness. Something crossed his face. She'd seen it before, that moment where his expression moved closer to the surface, like weather coming through. I'll contact Crane's attorney, he said. I'm not making any commitments until I know what he actually wants. Of course, she said, and if he wants to destroy me regardless, then we handle that too, she said, but find out first. They were 4 days from the ceremony when she went up to the property alone in the early morning to see what still needed to be done. The crew had finished the main work 2 days prior. The floors were repaired, the windows replaced, the chimney relined. Someone, she thought it might have been one of the younger workers, a boy of about 16 who had been particularly careful about every detail she'd specified, had swept the porch and cleared the overgrowth from the path along the meadow's edge. She walked through the main hall slowly. It smelled like fresh timber and stone dust, and something underneath that was the building's own particular smell, old and dry and somehow still present, the way old places are when they've been genuinely inhabited rather than just occupied. She ran her hand along the repaired section of floor and couldn't find the seam. Good work. The windows caught the morning light and threw it in long panels across the room. She went out to the meadow. The grass was still tall, still moving in the morning air, still dotted with the wildflowers she'd decided not to clear because they were better than anything they could have put there deliberately. The view east, down into the valley where Caldwell Ridge sat quiet in the morning, was the view Gideon's grandfather had built this place to face. She understood why. It was the kind of view that situated you, told you where you were in the geography of things, how the land lay around you and what you were a part of. She stood there for a while. She was thinking about the height marks on the door frame. She was thinking about Gideon at 24, exploiting a procedural weakness in a land dispute and building something from it, and then spending 12 years becoming the man who, when asked directly what he'd done, told the true version. She was thinking about Lucinda in her chair, holding herself upright, waiting. She was thinking about the contract in her desk at home, the document that had a termination date on it and a set of conditions and a clear, organized description of what this was and what it wasn't. She was also thinking about the fact that she had not, in 3 months, once experienced the arrangement as something she was enduring. It had been difficult at times, frustrating at times, confusing in ways she hadn't anticipated, but not something to endure, something she was actually inside with both feet in the way that she did everything she committed to. She didn't let herself think further than that. The line she was approaching was one she wasn't ready to cross in the privacy of her own thoughts, let alone anywhere else. She heard the wagon on the road before she saw it. She turned, expecting the crew, and found Gideon coming around the curve. He pulled up at the edge of the clearing and climbed down, and she noticed he was looking at the building rather than at her. The same quality of attention he'd had on the first morning, reading the property, taking inventory of what the years had done and left undone. The crew finished, she said, because something needed to be said. I can see that. He came to stand in the meadow, a few feet from her. I spoke with Crane's attorney. She turned to face him. And? He wants the Norris Creek access and a letter of acknowledgement that the original proceeding was conducted without full transparency. He paused. Not an apology. He was very specific. Not an apology. An acknowledgement. There's a difference. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. I've agreed to both. She looked at him. The morning light was direct and clear, and there was nowhere for either of them to be anything but visible in it. How did that feel? She asked. He considered this seriously, the way he considered most things. Like something I should have done a long time ago, he said, and also like something I couldn't have done a long time ago, so he paused. Both. That's an honest answer, she said. You have a way of making dishonest answers feel more trouble than they're worth, he said. And then, because it had come out sounding like something, he looked away toward the valley. The ceremony arrangements are confirmed. 63 guests. The Aldrich House is providing the catering and will transport it up. The weather forecast. Gideon, she said. He stopped. The building looks right, she said. You should walk through it before we leave. See what they did with it. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded and walked toward the house, and she followed at a slight distance, because she understood that a man who hadn't been inside that building in 20 years might need a few steps of that walk to himself. She waited on the porch while he went in. She could hear his footsteps on the new floor. Steady, unhurried, moving through each room in turn. A long pause that she knew, without being able to see, was the doorframe. When he came out, his face was arranged the way it always was. But something around his eyes was different, and she pretended not to notice because some things are more respectfully received when not directly acknowledged. "It's good work," he said. "Yes," she said. They stood on the porch together, looking at the meadow, and neither of them said anything else for a while. And that was all right. The mountains held their usual silence around them, and the grass moved in the wind, and 4 days from now this place would be full of people watching something that had started as a contract become, in ways she had not planned and could not entirely name, something considerably more complicated than that. She thought, "I am not ready for what comes next." She thought, "I don't think ready is going to be on offer." Below them, the valley lay in its ordinary morning light, and somewhere down there her shop was waiting. And Clara was sleeping late the way she'd begun to do now that the treatment was working and her body had stopped fighting itself so hard. And the whole regular structure of her life was going on without her. While she stood on a porch in the mountains and tried to figure out what she was actually feeling about a man she had signed a contract with and promised herself she would not confuse for something else. She was doing a poor job of the last part. "We should go back," she said. "We should," he agreed. Neither of them moved for another moment. Then they did. The morning of the wedding arrived the way mornings do when you've been dreading and wanting something in equal measure, too quickly, and with a quality of unreality that made ordinary things feel strange. The light through Evelyn's window was clear and early, the kind that comes before the heat of the day settles in, and she lay in bed for several minutes looking at the ceiling and taking stock of herself the way she sometimes did with difficult patience, systematically, without judgment, just trying to understand what was actually there. What was there? A low, persistent hum of something she'd been refusing to name for approximately 6 weeks. A clarity she hadn't asked for and couldn't send back. The understanding that she had arrived, over the course of 3 months and a rebuilt mountain property and too many honest conversations, at a place that was nowhere near where the contract said she would be. She got up. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table with the contract. She had taken it from her desk 3 days ago, for reasons she hadn't fully examined, and it had been sitting on the table since then. The same organized legal document she had read 17 times and had Ben Aldrich review twice. The same 12 pages with her amendments accepted in Gideon's handwriting in the margins. She looked at it now in the early morning light, and what she felt was not the steadying certainty she'd always gotten from written terms and clear conditions. What she felt was something closer to grief, not for a loss, but for the version of herself that had sat across from Gideon Blackwood in Aldrich's office and believed that clarity and feeling were going to stay in separate rooms. Clara came downstairs at 7, still in her nightclothes, her hair loose. She looked better than she had in a year. The treatment had been doing its quiet work for 3 months, and the evidence was in her face, fuller, less drawn, the particular exhaustion that had lived around her eyes since the winter finally beginning to recede. She looked at Evelyn at the table and then at the document and sat down without saying anything. They drank their tea in silence for a while. "You look like someone trying to talk yourself out of something," Clara said finally. "I might be," Evelyn said. "What are you trying to talk yourself out of?" Evelyn looked at her sister. "Knowing what I know," she said. Clara wrapped her hands around her mug. She was 17 and she had spent a year being sick in the particular way that shows you things about yourself and the people around you. And she had come out of it with a directness that hadn't been there before the illness. "Does he know?" she asked. "No," Evelyn said. "And today isn't—" She stopped. "I have a job to do today. Whatever else is true, I agreed to do something and I'm going to do it properly." "That's not really an answer to what I asked." "I know." Evelyn folded the contract and set it aside. "Help me with my hair." They arrived at the mountain property at noon, Evelyn and Clara together in a wagon with the Aldrich House catering staff, who had made the trip in good humor despite the road. The day had come out clear and cool, the kind of mountain weather that sits between seasons and belongs to neither. The light sharp and honest, the sky a deep, uncomplicated blue. The meadow was already set. She had arranged it herself. 2 weeks ago, on one of the early morning visits, she had walked the grass and decided where things would go with the same practical attention she brought to everything. Simple chairs borrowed from the community hall, arranged in the open meadow facing the mountain. Wildflowers from the meadow itself, cut and gathered that morning by the same 16-year-old worker who had swept the porch. The ceremony space required no more decoration than what the land already provided, which was, she had decided, the point. Lucinda was there before them, arrived ahead of the main party in a smaller wagon with her attendant, and she was standing at the edge of the meadow looking east toward the valley when Evelyn came to stand beside her. "Well," Lucinda said. "Well," Evelyn agreed. They stood together for a moment. The valley below was miniature and green in the distance, Caldwell Ridge visible as a cluster of rooftops and the flash of one or two windows catching the sun. Up here the air was different, thinner, cleaner, with the particular quality of high places that makes thought feel both more difficult and more necessary. "It's exactly as I remembered it," Lucinda said, "only the grass is taller." 15 years of undisturbed growing, Evelyn said. "Yes." The old woman was quiet for a moment. "He did this for me," she said. "You both did." "He loves you," Evelyn said. "He's not very good at showing it, but it's the most obvious thing about him once you know what to look for." Lucinda looked at her sidelong. "And you know what to look for?" Evelyn didn't answer that directly. "You should sit," she said. "Let me find you a good chair before the others arrive." Lucinda let herself be guided, which told Evelyn something about how much the trip had cost her in energy she didn't have to spare. The guests arrived over the following hour. The 63 who had confirmed and 3 who had not but came anyway, which was the kind of thing that happened in a small territory where an event of this scale was rare enough to pull people across inconvenient distances. She knew most of them. She spoke to the ones she needed to, accepted the congratulations that were offered with the same warmth she always used for things she was uncertain about, and kept one part of her attention on the road from the south, where she knew Gideon would come from. He arrived at 1:30. She saw him from across the meadow. He came on horseback rather than by wagon, which she hadn't expected, and he was alone except for Hatch riding some distance behind. He dismounted at the tree line and handed the reins to someone, and then he stood at the edge of the gathering for a moment, taking it in. She watched him look at the meadow, the chairs, the mountains. She watched his face do the thing it did when something reached it before he could manage it into neutrality. Then he looked across the crowd and found her, and the look held for a moment that was difficult to account for in the terms of their contract. She looked away first. She hadn't known about the inheritance clause. She learned about it 40 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, from the most unlikely possible source, Hatch, who came to find her where she was standing at the edge of the porch while the guests settled, and who stood there with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who has decided, after considerable internal debate, that something needs to be said. "Miss Mercer," he said, "there's something you ought to know before this proceeds." She looked at him. "Tell me." He was quiet for a moment. "The original terms of the Blackwood estate inheritance," he said carefully, "included a marriage provision, a clause requiring Mr. Blackwood to marry before his 35th birthday or forfeit a portion of the land holdings to a collateral branch of the family. It was one of the reasons the contract was proposed when it was." He paused. His 35th birthday was last Thursday. She stared at him. "The clause had a 30-day grace period," Hatch continued. "The attorneys confirmed last Tuesday that the grace period interpretation is complex. There is a reasonable legal argument that the provision was already satisfied by the registration of the marriage contract regardless of the ceremony date." He looked at his hat. "In practical terms, Mr. Blackwood no longer needs this marriage to secure his inheritance. The legal question is resolved. He is proceeding today for reasons that are," a pause, "not contractual." The meadow behind her was full of people and sunlight and the sound of 60-some guests finding their seats. Somewhere in the main hall she could hear Clara laughing at something one of the catering staff had said. The mountains stood where they always stood. "When did he find out?" she asked. "Tuesday," Hatch said. "The same day the attorneys confirmed it." Tuesday. 4 days ago. He had known for 4 days and had said nothing to her. He had driven up to the property with her on Wednesday, stood in the meadow, talked about Foster Crane and the Norris Creek access, and the view his grandfather had built the house to face, and had not said, "You should know that you're free to leave." "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Hatch looked at her steadily. "Because you deserve to know what you're agreeing to," he said. "And because I've worked for Gideon Blackwood for 11 years, and I've never seen him." He stopped, found a different way through. "I've never seen him not tell someone the terms of a thing. He tells people the terms. That's who he is." He paused. "He didn't tell you. I thought about why that might be, and I came to a conclusion that I felt was worth passing along." She was quiet for a long moment. "Thank you, Hatch," she said. He put his hat back on and walked away. She found Gideon inside in the small room at the back of the main hall that had been set aside for him to wait. A practical arrangement that had nothing romantic in its intention, but had taken on the texture of something more. The way practical arrangements had a way of doing when you weren't watching carefully. He was standing at the window looking out at the back of the property, the outbuildings and the tree line and the mountain rising beyond. He heard her come in and turned. He looked at her face, and something in his expression that controlled, carefully maintained neutrality shifted, like a seam coming slightly loose. "Hatch told you," he said. "It wasn't a question." "He did," she said. She came into the room and stood a few feet from him. "You knew Tuesday." "Yes." "And you didn't tell me." "No." He held her gaze. "I should have." "Yes," she said. "You should have." She looked at him steadily. "Why didn't you?" The silence that followed was not the usual kind. Not his compressed, thoughtful quiet, but something more exposed. She watched him navigate towards something he clearly found difficult terrain, and she waited, because she had learned that pressing him produced less than waiting, and because whatever he was finding his way to, she wanted the real version. "Because if I told you," he said finally, "you would have had a clear choice, and I wasn't—" He stopped. "I wasn't certain what you would choose, and I was not prepared for what it would mean if you chose to leave." The room was very quiet. "That's an honest answer," she said. Her voice was even, but something in her chest was doing something irregular. "I've been trying to give you honest answers," he said. "You make it difficult to do otherwise." She looked at him. The man standing in front of her was not the man whose name had appeared in Hatch's card 3 months ago. The name that represented the most feared lending operation in the territory. He was a man who had rebuilt a building for his grandmother, who had acknowledged an injustice he'd spent 9 years not acknowledging, who had sent a botanical reference book without a note because he wasn't ready to be thanked for it, who had known for 4 days that he was free and had not used that freedom to walk away. "You know what the contract says," she said. "I wrote it," he said. "It says 1 year. It says a quiet, amicable separation at the conclusion. It says—" "I know what it says, Evelyn." She looked at him for a long moment. "Do you want to follow it?" He was very still. "No," he said. "I don't." She breathed. "Then I need you to say that clearly. Not—" She paused. "Not implicitly. Not arranged around the edges. Clearly." He looked at her and she saw it happen. The decision to close the remaining distance between what he felt and what he said. The deliberate step across a line he had maintained for a long time. "I want a real marriage," he said. "Not the contract, not the performance. I want what we've been, what this has been, to be the actual thing." He paused. "I want you to choose it because you want it, not because you owe me anything, and not because the debt has shifted. I'm aware that's a complicated ask given how we started." "It is," she said. "I know." "I spent 3 months telling myself it was a contract," she said. "I was very thorough about it." "I know," he said. "I watched. And I wasn't—" She stopped, started again. "I wasn't wrong about you. At the beginning, you are what your reputation says, in some ways. You are strategic. You are cold in the way that you learned to be cold. You have done things that caused real harm to real people, and you called it business." "Yes," he said. He didn't look away. "But you're also someone who told me the true version when I asked for it," she said. "Every time. Even when the true version didn't make you look right." She looked at him steadily. "That's not a small thing. I don't know if you understand how not small that is." He said nothing, but his face, in this light, in this room, was doing none of the things it normally did. None of the careful management, none of the deliberate neutrality. Just a man who was uncertain and showing it, and not trying to stop showing it. "I'm not going to tell you I'm certain," she said, "because I'm not. I'm not the kind of person who claims certainty I don't have." "I know," he said, "but I'm also not—" She took a breath. "I stopped experiencing this as a contract somewhere around the second week. I didn't want to admit that because the contract was the thing that made it make sense. Without the contract, it was just—" "What?" he asked quietly. "Two people who started a thing for the wrong reasons and found out the reasons changed," she said. He looked at her. "Is that enough?" "I don't know," she said. "But it's true, and I think—" She paused. "I think true is a better foundation than most people start with." Something crossed his face. It was not the expression she would have predicted from the man she'd met 3 months ago, the flat, arranged neutrality that had so irritated and puzzled her. It was something considerably less organized than that, something that looked, without any other word for it, like relief. "There are 63 people in that meadow," he said. 66, she said. 3 came without RSVPs. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. She wasn't certain she had ever seen him fully smile, but it was the precursor to one, and it changed his face in a way that she had not expected and that she was going to have to think about later. "Evelyn." "What? Are you going to make me ask formally?" She considered this. "Probably not," she said, "but I want it on the record that you owe me a version of this conversation that does not take place 20 minutes before a ceremony." "Noted," he said, "and I want the Hartley lease extended by 3 years in the formal agreement." He stared at her. "The one we're negotiating right now," she said. "Consider it an opening position." Something that was definitely the precursor to amusement moved through his face. "You're negotiating the terms of our actual marriage while standing in a back room at our fake wedding." "The fake wedding that is about to become a real one," she said. "So yes, this seems like the right moment." He was quiet for a beat. 2 years on the Hartley extension," he said, "and I want the right to review your formulation notebook before you share it with outside suppliers." "That's not a reasonable—" She stopped. "Why do you want to review my formulation notebook?" "Because you've been developing 3 compounds that have applications I think could be significant," he said, with the matter-of-fact directness of someone who has been thinking about a thing for a while. "There may be a case for formal production. I have a meeting next month with a pharmaceutical distributor in—" "We are going to have a very long conversation about that," she said. "Yes," he said. "We are." He held out his hand, not in the formal, trained way he'd offered his arm at the Aldrich House dinner, but differently. Just his hand, open, waiting. She looked at it. She looked at his face. She took his hand. This. Lucinda watched them come out of the main hall together, and she did not comment on the fact that they were 3 minutes past the appointed time, or on the fact that something in the way they moved together had changed from what she'd observed earlier. She simply looked at Evelyn, and Evelyn looked back, and something passed between them that didn't require words because it had been a long time coming, and both of them had seen it approaching from some distance. The ceremony was short. The territorial judge who conducted it was a practical man who did not believe in stretching a legal procedure beyond its necessary elements, which suited everyone present. He said what needed to be said. Gideon said his part without prompting. Evelyn said hers. When it was done, Lucinda was the first to reach them. Moving with the deliberate, careful pace of someone whose body requires management, but reaching them nonetheless, and she took Evelyn's face in both hands, briefly, and looked at her with those dark eyes that had assessed and seen and withheld judgment through the whole complicated arc of this thing. "Well done," she said, simply that. Then she released her and turned to her grandson and said something to him too quiet for Evelyn to hear, and whatever it was made his face do the thing it had been doing in the back room. Open, briefly, like a window let up after being kept shut too long. It was during the gathering afterward, in the meadow and on the porch and through the main hall, that Foster Crane made his move. She'd been watching for it. She'd asked Hatch to keep an eye on where Crane was positioned during the ceremony, and Hatch had reported that the man had been present at the back of the gathered guests. Not invited, but not stopped, because stopping him would have created its own scene. He had watched the proceedings with an expression that Hatch described as calculating rather than celebratory, which told her the settlement of the Norris Creek access had not fully satisfied him. Or perhaps the settlement had been accepted and this was something else. A grudge that had grown past its original cause and taken on a life of its own. Crane made his move at 4:30, when the afternoon had settled into the comfortable looseness of a gathering that has passed its formal moments and become simply a party. He did it the way she'd expected, in the middle of a conversation that had gathered a small crowd, raising his voice just enough to carry beyond the immediate group, and beginning with the particular tone of someone who has decided he has nothing left to lose. "Remarkable, isn't it?" he said, to the cluster of guests around him. "What a man will construct to protect an inheritance. A hired bride, a theatrical ceremony, a show of domestic feeling for an audience of neighbors." He let that sit for a moment. "I've done business with Gideon Blackwood. I know how he arranges things." The crowd had gone somewhat quiet in that spreading wave way that crowds do when something sharp enters the air. Evelyn had been across the meadow when it started. She heard the shift in the noise before she understood the cause, and she moved toward it before she'd consciously decided to, crossing the grass at a pace that was not hurrying but was not stopping either. She heard Gideon's voice, level, controlled, before she reached the group. "Crane, this isn't the occasion." "I think it's exactly the occasion," Crane said. 60-some witnesses, your grandmother in attendance, everything looking genuine enough from a distance. He smiled in the way that men smile when they've been carrying something for a long time and have finally decided to put it down publicly. "I'm curious what the lady herself thinks. Miss Mercer, how much did he offer you? Or is it the debt he's forgiven? I understand your business partner left you in a difficult position." The crowd was very quiet now. Evelyn reached the edge of the group and stopped. She looked at Crane. This man she'd observed from across rooms, whose history with Gideon she'd made it her business to understand, who had been given a resolution and had not found it sufficient. She looked at him carefully, the way she looked at things she was trying to understand before she responded to them. Then she looked at Gideon. He was watching her. He was very still, in the way she knew meant he was managing something significant and waiting to see what she would do. She turned back to Crane. "My business partner did leave me in a difficult position," she said. Her voice was clear and even and carried to the edges of the gathered crowd without effort. "That's true. Mr. Blackwood offered me a contract that resolved the debt in exchange for a public arrangement. Also true." She paused. "I'm telling you this because I think you're owed a straight answer, and because I find it strange to be discussed as if I'm not standing right here." Crane blinked. He'd expected denial or deflection or Gideon's lawyers. He hadn't expected her. "So it is I'm not finished," she said. Not unkindly, but clearly. "What you're implying is that I'm a prop, that I was purchased and placed and have no more agency in this than a piece of furniture." She tilted her head slightly. "I'd like to address that." She let the silence hold for a moment. "I read the contract in full before I signed it. I had it reviewed by an attorney. I negotiated 2 amendments, which were accepted. At no point did I agree to anything I didn't understand." She looked at Crane steadily. "So the question of whether I was hired is technically accurate and entirely misleading. People enter arrangements of mutual benefit all the time. What determines whether those arrangements are honorable is whether everyone in them knows what they're agreeing to and has the ability to walk away." She paused. "I knew. I did." "And now?" Crane said, but his footing was already different. He'd come here with a weapon, and she had simply picked it up and described it before he could use it. "Now I'm married," she said, "to a man who built a case that wasn't fair 24 years ago." She saw the flicker cross Crane's face, and who acknowledged it when asked directly. "Who has been working through the territory doing things that looked like business and also caused real harm. And who, when someone put a notebook of consequences on his table, looked at it instead of away." She held Crane's gaze. "I know what he is. I also know what he's choosing to become. Those aren't the same thing, and I'd argue the second one is what matters." The meadow was very quiet. "You got your creek access," she said to Crane, more quietly now. "And you got an acknowledgement. If that's not enough for you, if what you actually need is to see him damaged regardless of what's been repaired, then I can't help you. But I'd ask you to consider whether carrying this for another 9 years is worth what it costs you." She paused. That's not my business. Just a thought. She turned and walked back toward Gideon. He was looking at her with an expression she had no category for. Something beyond the precursor to a smile. Something that was present and direct and not being managed at all. She reached him, and they stood side by side, facing the assembled crowd, which had collectively decided to begin talking again in the way that groups do when a difficult moment has been resolved by someone braver than they expected. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. "I know," she said. "You defended me." "I defended the truth," she said, "some of which happens to include you." She looked at him sidelong. "Don't make it more than it was." "Right," he said, and then, after a pause, "Thank you." She said nothing. But she didn't move away from him either, and they stood there together as the afternoon light began to soften and the mountains took on the purple of early evening, and the gathering moved around them, and Lucinda sat in her chair at the edge of the meadow with her eyes closed and her face tilted up toward the light. And Clara caught Evelyn's eye from across the grass and made an expression that communicated, without any words, that she was never going to let Evelyn live this down. Later, much later, after the guests had begun to make their way back down the mountain road and the catering staff were loading the last of their equipment, and Lucinda had been settled into the wagon with her attendant and sent ahead, Evelyn found herself on the porch steps in the last of the light, her shoes off, her feet on the cool porch floor, tired in the way that good and difficult days leave you tired. Gideon came and sat beside her. Not on the step. He sat in the chair on the porch, which was close enough that they were in the same space without requiring either of them to have made a decision about proximity. "Crane left without incident," he said. "I saw. Hatch thinks he won't be back." "Probably not," she agreed. A pause. The valley was lit up below them in the long horizontal light of early evening, gold and amber, and the particular clarity that comes right before sunset when the air is still. "I have something to tell you," he said. She looked at him. "The retreat property," he said. "I'd like to keep using it, not as an investment or a holding, just," he paused, "as what it was. A family place," she said. "Yes." She looked back at the valley. "That seems right," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm aware," he said carefully, that what I'm asking for, considerably more complicated than what we agreed to in the beginning, and that I'm asking it of someone who arranged the entire early part of this because she had no better choice." "I had a choice," she said. "I made it." "I know, but I want to—" He stopped, and she could see him working through how to say the thing he was trying to say without the armor that usually accompanied his saying of things. "I want to be worth it," he said finally. "What you're choosing. I want to give you actual reasons, going forward, not just—" "Gideon," she said. He stopped. "You already have," she said. The last of the light went gold and then amber, and then the soft gray-purple of mountain evening, and they sat on the porch of a building that had been rebuilt from the inside out over the course of 3 weeks, and was now, for the first time in 15 years, lived in again. Below them the territory stretched in its ordinary dimensions, flawed and complicated and full of people whose lives intersected with their own in ways neither of them had fully reckoned with yet. That was tomorrow's work. Tonight was this. The trouble, when it came, arrived not with the drama of a storm or the sharp edges of a man like Crane, but in the quiet, bureaucratic language of an official letter delivered to Gideon's office on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks after the wedding. Evelyn was in the shop when he came to find her. She knew from the way he walked through the door, not hurried, Gideon was never hurried, but with a particular quality of stillness that she had learned to read as the opposite of calm, that whatever he was carrying was serious. He waited until the customer she was helping had taken her package and left. Then he put the letter on the counter. She read it twice. The Territorial Infrastructure Commission had opened a formal investigation into 3 construction projects completed under Blackwood Enterprises contracts over the past 4 years. A bridge spanning Carver Creek on the northern road, a grain storage facility on the eastern edge of the territory, and a section of the main road through the Alderson Pass. The complaint, filed by a coalition of freight operators and landowners, alleged that the projects had been completed with substandard materials, that inspection records had been falsified, and that the construction supervisor responsible had operated with the knowledge and approval of the company's principal. That last line was the one that mattered. It pointed at Gideon directly. "Tell me what's true," she said when she'd finished reading. He was standing at the window, the same posture as the back room at the retreat property, looking out, managing something. "The bridge and the grain facility had problems," he said. "I knew about the grain facility after the fact. The supervisor substituted cheaper materials during the final phase, and I didn't catch it in the inspection review. The bridge—" He paused. "The bridge I should have caught during the build. I didn't review that phase personally. I delegated it." "And the road?" "The road is clean. The complaint includes it to make the scope look broader than it is." She folded the letter. "Who filed the complaint?" "A coalition," he said, "organized by someone. The freight operators have genuine grievances. There was a wagon lost on the Carver Creek Bridge last spring. A wheel went through a section of decking. Nobody was killed, but the load was destroyed and the family lost most of a season's income." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "You knew about the wagon, yes? Did you compensate the family?" A pause. "No?" She looked at the letter in her hands, then she looked at him. "Gideon, did you know about the wagon and choose not to address it because addressing it would have opened up the material substitution question?" The silence that followed was the kind she had learned to wait through rather than fill. "Yes," he said. She set the letter down on the counter. She took a breath. She thought about the notebook she'd brought him months ago, the informal audit of situations in the territory that intersected with his operations. She thought about what she'd said then. There's a difference between not helping someone and actively taking away what they already have. And she thought about what it meant that a family had lost a season's income and he had known and looked away. "That was wrong," she said. "I know. Not just strategically. As a matter of basic human decency, that was wrong. I know that too," he said. He turned from the window. His face was doing none of its managed neutrality. It was just tired and something else underneath the tiredness that she thought might be shame, which was a thing she hadn't seen in him before and which she recognized as costing him something to show. "I made a calculation. The compensation would have led to questions about the material substitution, which would have opened up the facility inspection, which would have—" He stopped. "It was a cascade I didn't want to deal with. And now the cascade is here anyway," she said, larger. "Yes." She stood at her counter for a moment, thinking. This was the thing about Gideon Blackwood that had never been simple and was not simple now. The fact that he was genuinely trying to become something different and was also genuinely still capable of the old calculations. Both things were true simultaneously, and loving him, which she had quietly admitted to herself sometime in the weeks since the wedding, meant accepting the full picture rather than the revised version. "All right," she said. "What are we going to do about it?" He looked at her. "We," she said. "Unless you'd prefer to handle this alone, in which case I'd point out how that approach has been working for you." Something moved through his face, not quite the precursor to a smile. This wasn't the moment for that, but something that was its relative. Acknowledgement, gratitude possibly, though he would never use that word directly. "Sit down," she said. "Tell me everything. Not the version that organizes it in your favor. The full accounting." He sat down. He told her. Boom. It took 3 hours to get the complete picture, and the complete picture was worse than the letter had suggested and better than the worst version she'd imagined. The bridge and the grain facility were the genuine problems. Real material substitutions, real shortcuts taken by a construction supervisor named Aldous Reed, who had been with the company for 7 years and had, over the past 3, been quietly shaving margins to cover losses in his personal accounts that he'd been concealing from everyone, including Gideon. The road was clean, as Gideon had said. There were 2 other projects that had minor deficiencies, not falsified inspections but inadequate review, work passed that should have been sent back. The family who had lost the wagon load on the Carver Creek Bridge was named Pollard. Martin and June Pollard, with 4 children, running freight on the Northern Road. They had filed a separate civil complaint that had been sitting in the territorial court system for 8 months with no response from Blackwood Enterprises, because Reed had been intercepting the correspondence. That last detail was the one that changed the shape of the thing. Gideon had not known about the Pollard complaint. When Evelyn put that piece together, cross-referencing the letter's timeline against what he'd told her about the wagon incident, she saw clearly that he had known about the accident and chosen not to investigate further, which had allowed Reed to bury the legal response. His sin was the original look away, not the subsequent concealment, Bubich. But a man who looks away from a consequence creates the conditions in which that consequence can be buried. And the distinction, while real, did not fully absolve him. She told him that plainly. "I know," he said, for the third time that afternoon. And by the third time, it didn't sound like a deflection anymore. It sounded like someone actually sitting with a thing. "Reed acted independently on the concealment," she said. "That's something, but you gave him the space to do it." She looked at the notes she'd been making throughout the conversation. "The commission investigation. How long? Months? Possibly 6. The formal process is slow." "Then we don't wait for the process," she said. "We get there first. Again." He looked at her. "You said that about Crane. It worked with Crane. This is considerably larger than Crane." "Yes," she agreed. "Which means the approach needs to be proportionally larger." She set down her pencil. "You go to the commission voluntarily before they schedule their first interview. You present a complete accounting of what happened, the material substitutions, the Reed situation, the Pollard complaint that was buried. You don't minimize and you don't dramatize. You present it as a failure of oversight, and you take responsibility for the oversight without taking responsibility for Reed's independent concealment, because those are genuinely different things, and conflating them would be dishonest in the other direction. And the projects themselves? You assess every structure that Reed touched, every one. You bring in independent engineers, not your own people, independent, and you make the results public regardless of what they find." She held his gaze. "If something is unsafe, you fix it. If it costs you significantly, you find a way. The cost of not fixing it is higher." He was quiet for a moment. "The Pollard family. First," she said. "Before the commission, before the public statement, before any of it. You contact them directly. You go yourself, not a lawyer, not Hatch. You go and you acknowledge what happened and you make it right." She paused. What would it take to restore what they lost? He thought about it seriously, which he had come to understand was not a performance of consideration, but the actual thing. The load was commercial freight. I'd need to verify the value. The time lost, the season's income, that's harder to quantify precisely, but there's a range. "Then determine the range and offer the upper end," she said. "Not because it's legally required, because it's right." He looked at her across the table. They were in the back of her shop, the same back office where she'd sat with the empty iron box 3 months ago and tried to understand the shape of what Marcus Webb had taken. The space was small and familiar and smelled like dried herbs, and it was the most honest room she knew. "You understand," he said carefully, "that doing this, the full accounting, the public assessment, the voluntary commission appearance, it will cost the company significantly, not just financially. The reputation damage could be considerable," she said. "Yes, I know." She looked at him steadily. "And if you try to manage this the old way, minimize, delay, let the process run its course and see if the damage can be contained, it will cost you everything, not just the reputation, the thing you're trying to become." He was very quiet. "You can't be that man and also be this one," she said. "I've watched you try to hold both for 3 months and it doesn't work. It produces moments where a family's legal complaint gets buried because you didn't want to look at the thing you'd already chosen not to look at." She paused. "I'm not interested in being married to the old version. I didn't choose that version, but the new one has to actually be new, which means it can't pick and choose when the cost is convenient." It was the most direct thing she had ever said to him, and she watched him receive it without flinching, which told her something important. "All right," he said finally. "All right," she said. "Then let's build the accounting." But they worked through most of that week. Evelyn closed the shop 2 afternoons to be present for the review process, not because she had expertise in construction or territorial law, but because Gideon needed someone in the room who would tell him when the language was starting to drift toward the managed version rather than the true one. And she had become, over the course of their months together, reliably capable of that particular function. The independent engineers came in on Thursday. 3 of them, sourced from outside the territory specifically, so there could be no question of existing relationships with Blackwood Enterprises. They were thorough and unimpressed by the company's size, which was exactly what was needed. Their assessment of the Carver Creek Bridge resulted in an immediate closure recommendation pending significant repair. The grain facility required structural reinforcement to 3 load-bearing elements. The road was confirmed clean. 2 additional Reed-supervised projects had minor deficiencies that could be corrected without closure. The bridge closure was the hardest piece. The Northern Road freight operators depended on it, and closing it meant a 22-mile detour that would cost them time and money through the summer season. Gideon arranged an emergency meeting with the operators, went himself, sat at their table, explained the situation in plain language, and presented a repair timeline of 8 weeks, along with a compensation structure for the detour costs. It was not a comfortable meeting. Some of the operators were angry, and their anger was legitimate, and he sat with it without defending himself past what was true, which was the thing she had been asking him to do and which she knew cost him something that she didn't have a precise word for, but understood as the distance between how he had operated and how he was operating now. She went with him to see the Pollard family on a Saturday, driving north on the road that would soon be closed for the bridge repair, through country that opened up into broad agricultural flatland where the freight families worked. Martin Pollard was a large, weathered man of about 40, with the particular wariness of someone who has dealt with powerful people's lawyers and has come to expect that wariness to be justified. He met them at his door without warmth, and Evelyn stood slightly back while Gideon spoke. She had told him, "Go yourself, no lawyers, acknowledge it plainly." He had done exactly that. He told Martin Pollard what had happened, the material substitution, the accident, the complaint that had been buried. He didn't frame Reed as a villain to hide behind. He said clearly that a failure of oversight in his company had allowed both the structural problem and the suppression of the Pollard complaint to occur, and that both failures were his responsibility to address. Martin Pollard stood in his doorway and listened to all of it. Then he said, "What are you proposing?" Gideon told him. The compensation figure, which was the upper end of the range Evelyn had asked for. Reimbursement of the legal costs the family had incurred in filing the complaint that had gone unanswered. An additional sum for the time the complaint had sat unaddressed. Not a legal requirement, a choice. Martin was quiet for a long moment. Behind him, through the door, Evelyn could see the kitchen and a woman who was probably June Pollard standing at the far end of it, not coming forward but listening. "I want it in writing," Martin said. "Witnessed." "Ben Aldrich will witness it Monday," Gideon said, "if that's acceptable." Another long pause. "All right," Martin said. He didn't offer his hand immediately. He looked at Gideon with the measuring look of a man deciding whether to believe something. "Why'd you come yourself?" "Because it was my failure," Gideon said. "Someone else's error started it, but my failure allowed it. That means it was mine to come and say." Martin Pollard nodded slowly. Then he offered his hand. It wasn't forgiveness. It was too early for that. And forgiveness isn't something that happens in a doorway. But it was the beginning of something that might become it, given time and the follow-through of what had been promised. On the drive back, Gideon was quiet for a long time. Evelyn let him be. "That was harder than I expected," he said finally. "Yes," she said. "I've had difficult business conversations, negotiations that cost me things." "This was different," she said. "This was different," he agreed. He was looking at the road ahead. The look on his face. "When I said it was my failure." He paused. "I've spent a long time being the person who doesn't have to account to anyone, by design." "I know," she said. "It's strange," he said, "to find that the accounting feels—" He stopped. "What?" "Like something I should have done more of," he said. She looked at him sidelong. "That's what accountability feels like when it's genuine," she said. "It doesn't feel good exactly, but it doesn't feel like loss either." He drove without speaking for a while, and she could tell he was turning that over in the particular way he turned things, thoroughly, without rushing to a conclusion. "I want to do something about the school building fund," he said. "The one Reeves sat on. I want to fund it directly." "The committee might not accept a direct gift from you right now," she said carefully, "given the commission situation. Then through a neutral structure, an infrastructure fund administered by a community board, something that's not mine in any visible way." She thought about that. "If it's not visible, you don't get the credit." "I don't need the credit," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the road, and his profile in the afternoon light was the face she'd been reading for months now. Still not easy, still with its reserves and its compressed places, but familiar in a way that she had stopped experiencing as surprising. She had gotten where she was going with this man, and it hadn't been the destination she'd planned, and it was the right one. "Then let's design it properly," she said. "Community-administered, transparent accounting, criteria established by the board rather than the donor. That way it outlasts any individual involvement." "Yes," he said. "That's what I want." Sit. The commission investigation ran its course over 5 months. Gideon's voluntary appearance, which had caused something close to consternation at the commission offices, as it was not, apparently, a common occurrence, established the terms of the inquiry in a way that would not have been possible if they'd waited for the formal process to unfold around them. The commission found what Gideon had presented: a contractor operating outside his authority, a failure of oversight, and a company that had, upon discovering the scope of the problem, acted to address it before being compelled to. The official findings were not gentle. There were fines, significant ones, and conditions on future government contracts, and a formal requirement for independent structural review of all Reedy supervised work, most of which Gideon had already completed. The territorial newspaper covered the investigation in 3 separate pieces, and the first 2 were the kind of coverage that follows a powerful man's failures with the particular relish that powerful men's failures generate. The third piece was different. It ran after the repair of the Carver Creek Bridge was completed ahead of schedule, and after the first community infrastructure grant had been awarded to the school building committee, and after June Pollard had written a letter to the paper describing the compensation meeting with a precision and honesty that Evelyn recognized as the kind of account that only someone who has been genuinely surprised by fairness produces. She read that third piece at the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning and passed it to Gideon without comment. He read it. He set it down. "That was June Pollard," he said. "Yes." "I didn't ask her to write anything." "I know," Evelyn said. "That's why it means what it means, wholesome." The Community Infrastructure Fund, by the end of that first year, had built the school's new building, repaired the water access issue on the South Road that had been in Evelyn's original notebook, and funded a small medical lending library. Not Evelyn's initiative, but she had provided the contents, pulling from her own collection and writing to suppliers in St. Louis and Denver for additional volumes. The library sat in the back room of the school and was available to anyone in the territory who needed it. She had been quietly insistent that it include works on women's health, which had generated one pointed conversation with the school board and resulted in the requested materials being shelved with the notation, "medical reference, professional consultation recommended," which she had accepted as a reasonable compromise. The herbal shop on Thistle Street expanded. Not dramatically. Evelyn was not interested in drama for its own sake. But the back room had been reconfigured to allow for a proper preparation space, with a second work table and a drying rack along the south wall. The pharmaceutical distributor Gideon had mentioned on the morning of their wedding had resulted in a meeting, and the meeting had resulted in a proposal for 3 of her compounds to be produced at a larger scale. And she had negotiated the terms of that proposal with the same care she'd brought to the original contract. Ben Aldrich reviewing the documents, amendments in her hand, nothing signed until she understood every clause. The formulation notebook now had a companion volume. The second one she kept in the shop's back room, and the first one she kept at home, and Gideon had read both of them with the same focused attention he'd shown the first day he'd picked it up. He had questions sometimes, technical ones, and she answered them with the same directness she answered everything. They had learned to disagree productively, which was harder than not disagreeing and more useful than either of the alternatives. Clara turned 18 that spring. She was entirely well by then. The doctor had used the word recovered at the last appointment, which was a word he'd been careful with for over a year and which he clearly felt he'd earned the right to say. She was considering a teaching position in one of the smaller communities along the northern road. She had not made up her mind, which was, Evelyn thought, the correct approach. There was no urgency in the decision, and the absence of urgency was itself a kind of arrival. At the graduation celebration, a small dinner at Evelyn's house, Clara raised a glass of water and looked at her sister and said, "You're happy." "Yes," Evelyn said. "You look different from when you were just surviving." "That's because I'm not just surviving." Clara looked at Gideon, who was sitting at the far end of the table, helping himself to a second portion of something and appearing to be listening to the conversation without appearing to be listening to it. You're different too, she said to him, with the directness of a 17-year-old who has decided she has earned the right to say most things. He looked at her. In what direction? Better, Clara said. He considered this. That's a reasonable assessment, he said. Evelyn looked at him across the table, and he looked back at her. And in his face she saw the thing she had come to understand as the truest version of him. Not the man who had walked into her shop 3 months after their contract began and admitted the true version of a 9-year-old land dispute. Not the man who had sat at the Pollard family's door and said it was my failure, but the man who had become capable of those things. Who had learned, in the particular slow and unglamorous way that adults learn things they should have learned earlier, that accounting for yourself is not the same as losing. What? Ding? Lucinda died in late autumn. It was not sudden. She had been declining steadily through the summer, the way the doctors had warned, and she had done it with the same uprightness she'd brought to everything else. She had spent 2 more afternoons at the retreat property before the season turned too cold. She had read every book Evelyn brought her. She had conducted what she called a final inventory of opinions on several subjects: territorial politics, the current state of the main road, the shortcomings of the new preacher in the 2nd Street parish, and had shared these opinions with anyone who came to sit with her. On the last afternoon Evelyn sat with her, Lucinda had held her hand for a while without speaking. Then she'd said, "You chose well." Evelyn had looked at her. "You did too," she said. "When you came into my shop." Lucinda had smiled, the one that changed her face, the one that came from somewhere genuine. "I wasn't choosing," she said. "I was investigating. The choosing was yours." She died 3 days later, quietly, which was what she would have asked for if anyone had asked. Gideon was composed through the funeral and the days that followed, the way he was composed through most difficult things, not absent, but managed. Evelyn didn't try to make him process it differently. She was present, and she made sure the house had food in it, and she handled the correspondence that needed handling. And once, late at night when she came downstairs and found him sitting at his desk in the dark not working, she sat with him in the dark without asking him to explain it. After a while he said, "She saw it." "She did," Evelyn said. "She knew," he said, "from the beginning, about the arrangement. I know. She let us figure it out ourselves." "Yes," Evelyn said. He was quiet for another moment. "She was—" He stopped, then started differently. "She was the last person who knew me from before all of it. Before the company, before the decisions." He paused. "You're the only person now who knows both versions." She looked at him in the dark. "Then I'll remember both," she said. "That's what I'm here for." He reached across and took her hand. He didn't say anything else, neither did she. They sat there until the candle burned low, and it was enough. It was the right kind of enough, the kind that comes not from everything being resolved, but from 2 people having decided to face the unresolved parts together. So, 2 years after the wedding, they stood in the mountain meadow on a late afternoon in early June. The grass was as tall as ever. The wildflowers were different this year, more yellow than purple, some change in the season's rainfall. And the mountains were the exact shade of dark green that they become in early summer before the heat bleaches them toward gray. The retreat property was used regularly now. 3 times a summer, sometimes 4. Not for business. Gideon had maintained that line clearly. But for the purpose it had originally served, family. Clara had come twice with a friend from the teaching position she'd taken. Ben Aldrich and his wife had spent a weekend there at Evelyn's invitation, which had generated a dinner conversation that went until midnight and ended in an argument about territorial water rights that nobody fully won. One of the Pollard children, the eldest, a girl of about 12, had come with her mother June for an afternoon, part of something that had become slowly a genuine acquaintance between the families. None of that was smooth. None of it was the story you'd tell if you wanted to make it sound simple. The Blackwood Company had lost contracts it didn't recover. There were people in the territory who had made up their minds about Gideon years ago and had not found the subsequent years sufficient reason to revise them. Evelyn's expanded shop had had a difficult first winter when a supplier's shipment failed, and 3 of her regular preparations were out of stock for 6 weeks. They had argued about money twice, once badly, and the bad argument had involved things said that took several days to fully account for. But they were standing in the meadow, In the early June light, and Evelyn was looking at the valley below in the same view Gideon's grandfather had built the house to face, the same view she had stood in front of on that first morning and said it's extraordinary before she'd decided it was wise to say it. The Norris Creek situation, Gideon said. He was standing beside her, looking at the same valley. Crane's filed for a full transfer of the access rights, wants to make it permanent rather than an arrangement. Is that a problem? No, we can formalize it. The original arrangement was always meant to be a starting point. He paused. I called his attorney. They're willing to negotiate a permanent easement that works for both operations. Good, she said. There's a version, he said, where I handle that alone. Write the terms, send them over, done. There's also a version, she said, where you let me read the draft before it goes. He looked at her sidelong. The Norris Creek easement terms are outside your area of expertise. The relationship with Crane is not, she said. I know how that conversation went. I know what he needed to hear and what he was willing to accept. Let me read the draft. A pause. All right, he said. She looked at the valley. The school board is meeting next week about the addition. They want to know if the infrastructure fund would consider a contribution for the new classroom. Tell me the numbers, he said. I'll bring you the proposal. She glanced at him. You should come to the meeting. The board meetings are long. They're long and they matter, she said. You funded the school. You should see it work. He was quiet for a moment. You're going to keep doing this, he said. Bringing you to school board meetings? Bringing me toward things I'd rather manage from a distance. She considered that. Probably, she said. Is that a complaint? He looked at her. The evening light was in his face, and it made him look different from the man who had walked into her shop. Not younger exactly, but less armored, the way a face looks when it's had time to stop bracing against something. No, he said, it's not a complaint. She looked back at the valley. She thought about the contract on her desk at home, which she had never thrown away. Not out of sentimentality. She was not particularly sentimental, but because it seemed important to keep the record of where things had started. The terms, the amendments in her handwriting, the clean legal language of a 12-month arrangement that had described something so different from what it had become that it was almost another document entirely. She thought about what she would say if someone asked her what she had learned from this, from the whole unlikely arc of it, the debt and the contract and the fake marriage that had quietly become something real. She thought she would say, the wrong beginning doesn't disqualify what comes after, that people are not fixed things, that choosing someone is not a single event. It's a practice, repeated daily, in the ordinary and difficult texture of sharing a life. That the most important conversation she'd ever had happened at kitchen tables and in back offices and on porches in the dark, not in the formal architecture of agreements. She would also say, and she believed this in the particular way that you believe things you've arrived at through actual experience rather than principle, that demanding honesty from someone is a form of respect. Not comfortable respect, but the real kind. The kind that says, I think you're capable of the true version, even when the true version costs you something. The kind that refuses to let the people you love off the hook, because letting them off the hook is easier than holding them to what they can be. She had done that with Gideon. He had done it back, in his own way. The question he'd asked on the mountain porch, are you going to make me ask formally, had been its own version of the same thing. A refusal to let her hide behind the contract when they were both standing in the same place, choosing the same thing. I want to plant something along that west edge, she said, where the grass thins out near the tree line. Plant what? Something that comes back every year without being tended. She looked at the tree line in question. Lavender, maybe, or yarrow. It's hardier at this elevation. I'd need to check the soil. You're going to start a garden at a mountain property we visit 4 times a year. I'm going to plant something that will be there whether we visit or not, she said. That's different. He was quiet for a moment, then, I'll get you the soil measurements. She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. That direct, unguarded attention that still surprised her sometimes, still arrived before she was ready for it. Thank you, she said. For the soil measurements? For all of it, she said. That's what I mean. He didn't say anything, but he reached over and took her hand the way he'd taken it in the dark after Lucinda died, without announcement, without framing it as a gesture, just as the thing it was. And they stood there in the early summer light, with the valley below them, and the mountains behind them, and the long grass moving in the wind, and it was not a perfect moment. It was a real one, which was better. The territory stretched out below, all its complications and unfinished business, and the ordinary daily difficulty of people trying to live alongside each other with what they had. The school that was getting a new classroom, the Pollard family on the northern road, the freight operators whose bridge was now sound, the Hartley family's cattle on the eastern section, the small medical library in the back of the school building where someone, some future morning, would find a book they needed. None of it had come from a contract. It had come from two people who had made a transaction and then made something else out of it, something harder to name and longer to build in worth in the end, considerably more than what either of them had set out to get. That is the thing about starting somewhere you didn't choose. It doesn't determine where you end up. What determines where you end up is what you're willing to do once you get there. Whether you look at the notebook, whether you say the true version, whether you let yourself be seen by someone who is paying attention. Evelyn Mercer had walked into a debt and come out the other side with a life she had not imagined and would not trade. Not because it was easy, and not because it was clean, and not because the man standing beside her had become someone else entirely, but because they had both, in the slow and unglamorous way of real things, become more themselves, and had been paying enough attention to notice. The sun moved down toward the mountain ridge. The grass kept moving. Below in the valley, Caldwell Ridge lit its first evening lights. They stayed until the dark came, and then they went inside.